Hi everyone, I'm Wendy Muse, creator of the LeftPOC Project, which seeks to bring you the history of leftists of color one swipe at a time. And this is the LeftPOC Project podcast. So I am back from a 6-month research trip. I went to Brazil, Portugal, and Mozambique, and then back to Brazil before coming back to the United States. So this particular episode 19, our year in review, I recorded with Richard while I was still in Brazil. So there's a little bit of crunchiness on my end in terms of the sound, so my apologies in advance. Just be ready for that. But for the most part, the internet played along during the recording and everything worked out. Richard and I talked a bit about some more recent events, but also have a larger conversation about ways that we can think about the left in the United States so that it's not just navel-gazing and that we actually have, we take into consideration things that are going on around the world and ways that we can not only improve our own personal leftism, but to make sure that when we do that, we're conscious of what's happening and how we and our government is affecting others beyond just citizens in the United States. We talked about Gilets jaunes, which is the yellow vest protest in France, and some things that were missing from the media representation thereof. And we also just sort of talk about where we see things going in 2019 and whether there's any hope for the future. I know that sounds a bit bleak, but it's something that we have to really wrap our heads around and think about where things are going, not just in terms of the general U.S. government, but in terms of the way we, as leftists of color, think of leftism and what the future holds for those of us who want to see the United States become a much more progressive place and one that's plugged in with the rest of our comrades around the world. So plug in, because this is a long one. Try to relax if you can, even though we talk about some rather dark subjects. But this is a 3-hour-long episode, so feel free to press play, pause, come back to it. We have quite the discussion on our hands here, so enjoy, and thanks so much in advance for listening. You know what? I'm going to record from the jump. And I say this because what ends up happening is you and I will talk for like 2 hours and then we'll decide, oh yeah, now let's start recording.
Fair enough.
Yeah, we should probably just start recording because usually so much good stuff gets lost because we're not recording.
Fair enough.
So, yeah. So first thing, I just want to say I'm really sick. I'm getting sick. I'm in that like weird stage where stuff is hurting and like my throat is hurting, my ears are hurting. You know what I mean? When you swallow and it like hurts your ear. Because here in São Paulo, which is where I am right now, it is every day is different. And like weather.com is a freaking joke because they can't handle tropical weather, I guess. So whenever word to the wise, do not use weather.com. They're not sponsoring us, so I can say this. Don't use weather.com when you go to any place that's considered tropical. So like here it has been cold usually, and this is normal for Sao Paulo, but like it'll be freezing cold one day and then like burning up hot the next, and then raining and hot and raining and cold all in like the span of about 3 days. And weather.com is always wrong, and usually it's actually colder inside the houses than outside. So if you're sick or like recovering from the 1,001 weather changes that happened in the span of 2 or 3 days, being inside is like, it makes it worse almost because you're cold. So there's no winning, none at all. So yeah, I'm sorry for my voice for you and for anyone who's listening. My voice is like awful right now, so I apologize.
We'll be okay.
Yeah. So you and I are supposed to be doing a year in review, which is scary. Like, I can't believe it's already the end of 2018, which is kind of weird.
Yeah.
How was your year?
Oh man, it's been a ride.
Yeah.
There's so much going on, and I mean, one of the things that I have enjoyed over the year is this learning process that I've been on about, the history and the theory behind socialism, communism, and about liberation and about the stories that motivated people and that and documented their experiences, and the little hope that is still remaining is coming from those sources at the moment. Mm-hmm. So this experience with the LeftPOC project, and then also on the research I've been doing on my own outside, has been an enlightening experience, and I'm incredibly thankful for it. So.
And speaking of research that's being done for LeftPOC project and outside of it, for the next few episodes, not this episode, but the next 2 episodes, we're going to be talking about Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed. So for those of you who are interested in reading along with us and then checking out the episode, I've already posted a free full PDF of the book on the LeftPOC project Patreon page, which is open to the public, by the way. So for anyone who's coming on to this new for LeftPOC project, we don't have any episodes or materials or anything that are behind a paywall. So all of the stuff that we post, that we discuss, and everything is always free for anyone who's interested in it. And if you want to give us a donation to help fund and pay for our assistants and data storage and coffee and all those things that I'm like really transparent about, actually, you can find all that info on Twitter. But for anyone who wants to donate to us, they're welcome to. But anything that we talk about, discuss, go over, read even, is always available through some free means. So for right now, you can get the whole book for free as a PDF on Patreon. But yeah, I think that like you're the one who suggested Pedagogy of the Oppressed. So I'm laughing because everyone knows that I researched Brazil. And so Brazil is always on my mind, and that's where I'm right now, for example. But it was Richard actually who suggested we read Paulo Freire's book, he is Brazilian, and actually has come up in the news again lately, even though he's been deceased for a while. But this whole debate about, the influence of Marxism and like creeping leftism and blah, blah, blah. We can talk about Brazil in a minute because that's on my year in review. Now that they're like under the new president is a fascist. But yeah, I'm laughing even though it's very serious. It's a sad topic, but I'm laughing just because like it's so absurd that sometimes you can't do anything but laugh because it doesn't seem real, But it doesn't seem real to me that like people are still debating Paulo Freire as like some sort of menace. And I'm reading about him in my own research as someone who was like hunted and harangued by the military dictatorship. And so to think that now, like 60 something years later, people are still having these weird ass debates about Paulo Freire somehow being a threat to the state and he's deceased. Like, I don't know. It's just, people are really desperate to find an enemy. And unfortunately, it's to the detriment of the population. It's not really doing anything but like hurting people. So, but it serves no other purpose other than that. But we can get to Brazil in a minute because, like I said, that's in my year in review. But I mentioned all of that to say, for those of you who are sticking around for the next few episodes, which will come out in 2019, the beginning of the year, they're going to be about Pedagogy of the Oppressed. So just be sure to check out the full book on the Patreon page. So yeah, sorry about that. That's I always have these little infomercial moments in the podcast, but they're necessary. Otherwise, people wouldn't know,
Absolutely. No, and it gives me opportunity. One of the things that I came across while doing, or a couple of things I came across, one was a discussion put on by Harvard with Noam Chomsky and a French professor. And they talk about Freire, and so I'm sorry, I'm going to butcher the name. I can try to Freire, but I'm probably just going to make it work.
Freire is correct. You said it right the first time. Yeah, Freire.
So they're discussing him, and it was just an interesting experience, just because you mentioned the two of the prevalent takes on Freire, and the last one that I saw, that I also saw repeated throughout some of the literary critiques that I read online, was represented by this guy from Harvard, who essentially doesn't seem like he got past the foreword by Donald Macedo, and was personally affronted by what he wrote about Harvard, and then was looking at the document as in, like, basically he was looking at it like a curriculum for literacy, which is, I guess, apparently in a lot of academic fields, particularly in the the right leaning or the more traditional academia, that's as far as a lot of people got with what he was going. They looked at it as a project for literacy in Brazil, and they look at it and then they're like, oh well, this doesn't, I can't bring this into rural Georgia for a community with low literacy and use it, and it reflected to me a lack of engagement with the material, because what I read seems to be applicable to all different parts of life and far beyond just educating people for literacy purposes. And so I'm really excited about getting into it. And it was a little dense, and so it's tough, but there's a variety of places that you can engage with the material. The one other thing I was going to mention is there's a book out, but there's also an interview with about the main subject of the book, but it's called Tuesdays with Maury. And it's about a professor who essentially, I think, very much lived a lot of what was talked about in Pedagogy of the Oppressed. And I didn't see either in the book or in the interview him mention the Pedagogy of the Oppressed specifically, but you saw him implement it and just live it in a lot of different ways. But so that would be another good thing I would suggest people watch, but it's got a sad ending, so I wouldn't watch that unless you're ready to cry.
Oh my God. So it's so funny that you mentioned this, because when I was I think I was in college or like the end of high school, and we watched this movie, and like sometimes now that you're an adult and you reflect back on things that you saw maybe 10, 20 years ago or read 10 or 20 years ago, and at the time you were like, oh my God, what the hell is this? Like, why am I reading this? I don't understand any, or like you understood it, but you just understood it at face value, And then when you're an adult, you like reflect back on things, and things kind of come full circle and start to make sense. So that is a book/movie that I definitely need to revisit, because all I remember at the time was being like, this is so freaking boring. What is this? Like, why are we watching this? So now that you've linked it to Freire, I definitely have to go back and watch it. Like, now I feel more motivated to go back, because I had forgotten that it even existed, just because I was so bored at the time. So don't take my word for it. Listen to Richard, because Richard is watching it as an adult and not like a bored 18-year-old who doesn't care about these sorts of things. So, and especially if you're saying there's a link there, like I'm super excited now to go back and kind of revisit what the movie, and it's a book too, right? It's like based on
a book
and a movie.
A movie, and then there's an interview that you can find on YouTube with him and the teacher and Ted Koppel. And
oh wow.
Ted Koppel comes off as not getting it also. Right.
Of course.
But the teacher, the professor is patient enough and works through it. And it's really, it's enlightening, and it's an emotional experience.
Wow, you were teaching me stuff tonight. I really had no idea there was any connection there. So I'm super excited now to go back to it, because obviously Freire's work is important. And actually, Freire's work is part of my own research, because a lot of people don't know about this side of his work, but he actually went to Guinea-Bissau, which is one of the former Portuguese colonies in Africa, and like helped them implement their education plan following independence. And he engaged a lot with Lusophone African leftist leaders and stuff. So there are a lot of links between what he was doing at the time and what other people were doing in my work. But that's kind of outside of Brazil and outside of these Lusophone African countries. There's not a lot of information about his travels around the world, and particularly to Africa, and how he impacted and how they also impacted his work in Brazil, which is my question, right? Like, I'm more interested in how his travels to Brazil kind of bounced back or how his travels beyond Brazil, kind of bounced back into his work once he was back in the country that he was born in, and, was actually implementing a lot of things in. So it'll be, now that I know about the Tuesdays with Maury link, I feel like my work is going to become even deeper. I'm going to learn some stuff that I didn't know about at the time that I actually saw. I don't know. I feel bad now. Like, I feel like, yeah. And I hope, what I hope? I hope that like students that I have now who I'm telling, I remember this past semester in particular when I was teaching, this was like in fall of 2017. when I was teaching that semester, I remember talking a lot about Brazil because it's an African diaspora class. So obviously if you're talking about slavery and like Afro descendant populations, Brazil is going to be on the list of places you talk about. And I hope that now, considering what's happened in Brazil politically, and it's been in the news quite a bit in the United States because of who's become president, I wonder if my students will one day, if not already, kind of look back and say, oh, no wonder Wendy talks so much about Brazil. Like, now it makes sense, like, okay, what she mentioned about, the creeping right in Brazil, or like the increasing religious conservatism in Brazil, all those things. I hope that they can kind of put two and two together, if they haven't already done so, to think about that, like I am now doing or going to do with Tuesdays with Maury, when I was probably rude to my professors and being like, why are we watching this?
Right? I mean, it's interesting how that works out. Like how
yeah.
I can imagine, I've thought, or, in my head sometimes as a student, like, oh, this is what I would like them to be talking about. And then I could just imagine how many times that they were talking about something important and I just wasn't able to see it.
Yeah. That's what our podcast is for. We're to help fill in the blanks
right?
for stuff you missed when you were in high school or college. We're here to give you the real down low on what that stuff is about. That's why we're here. Yeah.
Oh, no, it's interesting you mentioned the rising of the right in Brazil, and I think that going to our year in the review a little bit, like that's one of the things that we've seen is a rising of the right, not just in the United States but globally. And
yeah.
I think for some people, they've seen how neoliberalism has played an integral part of the rising of the right, as opposed to, it happening in a vacuum or because of the right dominating politics in general.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think this is another plug, but for those of you who are interested in hearing about the Brazil side of the right growth, that sounds weird, like I'm talking about some sort of tumor or something. But again, like the right growth as opposed to the left growth. But yeah, it is sort of, I mean, if you think about it, the right politics did sort of metastasize, in a lot of ways. It's almost as if overnight we kind of looked up and said, oh crap, like every country almost is being run by a right-wing leader of some sort, if not completely fascist, and especially in Latin America. And that's what's interesting, because I think for a long time, people were not really paying attention to Latin America because so many people, including those on the left, are constantly focused on the West. And so they weren't looking at places like Asia, the Middle East, I mean, obviously the Middle East, but only for the sake of war, right? But they weren't looking at political movements that were happening there. They definitely weren't looking at political movements that were happening in Latin America, most of which the U.S. was orchestrating, like literally to put the right in power. All this stuff is happening under our nose. And I think, it's frustrating for those of us, myself included, but like, I'm just one little person. I'm not like, anyone important, but I was talking about this rightward growth in Latin America. And I think a lot of people just kind of ignored it. They were like, oh, well, whatever, it's not a big deal. And then Trump got elected. And then all of a sudden people gave a shit about the fact that like, oh, the right is growing all over the world, including these countries that we don't like to give second thought about, that we've actually been messing with forever, basically. I mean, I can't think of a period in time during which the U.S. wasn't, like, once the U.S. was established as a country, there's not a period in its history when it wasn't messing with Latin America, basically. So it's frustrating that like people kind of slept on that. But the plug here is that, so I don't dominate the entire discussion today talking about Brazil, if you're interested in learning a little bit more about like how Brazil ended up with a fascist as president-elect, Jair Bolsonaro, you can listen to several podcast interviews that I did recently with other podcasts like Delete Your Account. I did an interview with Season of the Bitch, and I also did an interview with Historically. And I posted all of those on the Patreon site as well, so people can go and check those out if they want to learn a little bit more. And obviously I have 2 really big threads on what happened in the 2018 election for Brazil on my personal Twitter page. I also linked them on LeftPOC, and if I'm not mistaken, I put them on the Patreon, but if I haven't already, I will post those just for people who want to get a kind of background, a little bit of background info without having to sit through 30 minutes right now of me talking about Brazil, which I'm not going to do because I'm like, I'm exhausted. I don't even want to talk about Brazil anymore. It's like so frustrating. And it's depressing. Like I'm here right now and I think things are pretty calm before the storm, you know, like it kind of has that weird feeling because the president doesn't become president until January 1st of 2019. So right now they're kind of in this lull moment and it's right before Christmas and whatever, you know, so people are kind of like, I don't know, things are kind of slow right now. And the president-elect has been doing all sorts of effed up stuff already. He's in trouble right now for a corruption scandal, of course. So there's a lot of stuff going on. But it's also really, it's like all quiet right now. And I think that, I don't know, I hope people are preparing for what could happen. But I think also people are just tired. You know what I'm saying? Like, I don't know. I don't know how to put it. But yeah, anyway, back to the discussion. I keep derailing us. My apologies.
Oh, no worries.
Back to the real discussion, the year in review. We were talking about the year in review. So my apologies. And the growing right wing around the world. This is where it's your fault, Richard. You led me down this path.
Well, I think there's a real interconnectedness between a lot of these themes and stories that we're hearing. And one thing that you mentioned that stuck out to me, and I've seen more clearly throughout the year, is how much the West, or even leftists in the West, seem to disregard the rest of, especially the global South, and how little of a mention it gets in the conversation. The way I see that manifested most recently is in the Green New Deal idea, and like essentially this is our best path forward towards dealing with the three primary, you know, catastrophic events that are slated to occur over within the next 100 years. So that's, you know, energy shortage, drinkable water shortage, and climate refugees from rising tides, and so and massive, you know, displacements. So those three things are three events that basically all the science says are going to happen in the next 100 years. It's just a matter of how we're going to address them. And
clearly, we're going to address it by shipping people to Mars. That's the best way to deal with climate change. We're just going to turn the world into Blade Runner, pretty much. That's the plot of Blade Runner. Like they have all these separate planets that people live on, and like slave colonies and stuff. So I think that's going to be our next path.
And that's the upshot. I mean, the more like the more depressing one is we don't even get to space, and we're just Mad Maxing it here in the wasteland that we created.
I love that our two alternatives are like really funny, or not funny, but like extreme dystopian 80s like films. You know,
right?
Like, do you want Mad Max or do you want Blade Runner? Like, those are your options. Good luck.
Right? It's like, so then you see in Blade Runner, it's like, well, you know, they had some cool stuff, I guess. Like, although I admit, you know, like, you know, riding on the front of a like semi truck playing guitar with big flaming stacks behind me sounds pretty awesome too.
Yeah.
So getting shot at, having no potable water, and all those other, you know, things, not so much. But,
and then the question is, like, is our dystopian future the 80s version of these films, or like the recent remakes?
Right.
And like, which one is worse? Like, is the newer, more like better CGI versions of these dystopias, is it better or worse than like the 80s option?
Yeah. Well, I mean, now that I think about it, I guess Escape New York was pretty good. Like the Escape series. So I don't know. If I'm picking a
Did
dystopia.
they remake this?
No remakes though. So I guess it just bridged the 80s and 90s. So
Okay. Well, I'm gonna go with Blade Runner, I think, just because I don't know. I think Blade Runner sounds like a better option because there is an escape, right? Like if you manage to get to another planet, you have that option. But
it does seem the most hopeful of the dystopias.
Right, yeah. Like there's a glimmer of hope. Like if you're rich enough, you can get off the Earth. But in Mad Max, you don't. You're just like stuck. Sand and stuff. Like I can't deal with that. That's too much for me.
Yeah, I mean, we joke, but like the thing that gets me is like when you look at how this Green New Deal, and I mean, there isn't really much to it yet. It's mostly just like the concept of, hey, climate change is happening. We have to do something on like a Hoover Dam moonshot type scale because that's how serious this issue is, and it's that serious and more.
Right.
And so like, but when you look at it, most of the advocates of the Green New Deal, and if you look at the phrasing and how they talk about it, you won't see much mention of the global south at all, let alone, you know, where is this green revolution coming from? Where are all these raw materials getting taken from? And it's not from the United States. And it's like, so what it sounds and looks like is, I mean, you got the Republicans and the right in the U.S., which is essentially seems to either be banking on Mars or dying before this becomes a problem. And you got the left, which is mitigating it in such a way that basically it's still going to sacrifice billions of people across the global south. And that there is no, that it doesn't leave any hope for them. It's just a way to mitigate those experiences for people in the U.S.
And this has been a debate for a really long time too, actually, because like one of the things that I remember people saying a few years ago, even not even now, but like a few years back before we even were calling things a Green New Deal, was there was a concern on the part of people who were really concerned about environmentalism and sort of like mineral mining and things like that in especially in sub-Saharan Africa. This discussion about technology being dependent upon all these mining industries that were incredibly exploitive, right? And even in the discussion of veganism, which that has also been forwarded as like one, you know, personal thing that people can do if like the majority of the country stopped eating so much meat because of the destruction that the meat industry causes, right? Factory farming and all of that in terms of its environmental impact. But one of the arguments that people were making was like, well, that's great and all, but what do we do about like all the incredibly harmful stuff that's happening in the farming industry as well, right? And how can we like bridge all of these smaller movements so that there's more humanitarian approaches to every industry and thus, you know, a way to kind of like counteract the long-term destruction that they've been involved in. And as you said, there's often this, it's sort of like the people who are the victims of even our seemingly pro-ecological movements are always left as kind of an afterthought, you know, like how do we, I think it's hard when we talk about these things because especially if we reduce it to all things that like people can do on an individual level, right? Because for me, I'm not saying don't do these things on an individual level. You should, you know, eat less meat. You should recycle. You should, you know what I'm saying? You should reduce waste and things like that. That's all positive. But the question is, how can we also be mindful of the impact that we're having beyond our personal choices, right? Like on a systemic level, what can we do to reduce harm? Especially, as you said, I think, and this is a super important point, on a global scale, right? And also how, like, the other thing that I think about all the time too in these discussions is, you know, why are we not looking to the quote unquote global south for remedies or like ways to fix this? Because if you look at who's wasting the most and like who's producing the most waste in terms of pollution and things like that, who is it? Like, it's not them. You know what I mean? We're dumping it all on them at the end of the day. So how can we kind of, I don't know. I mean, how do we in rhetoric and in action decenter the West? And then also hold the West accountable for all the shit that it's doing to make the climate change situation even worse.
Yeah, there's a recent report published, I think, in GQ and a couple other places that they mentioned it, that essentially said that about 70% of the problem is coming from about 100, the top 100 companies. And so it's the boardrooms in those the billionaires in those boardrooms that actually can make these changes. They can call a meeting tomorrow and implement new policies, regardless of whether we want to consume as much as we do now, half as much or twice as much. Is like they actually have the control and the power based off of how our system works. And so essentially we realize that this isn't happening to them. This is something that they are participating in. And And I guess we ask ourselves is like, what's their plan? What are they thinking? How does this work out for them? Because presumably it seems as though at least that there must be an upshot for them in this scenario.
I mean, I think for them it's just like they know that they'll be all right until the end, until the earth just completely destroys itself. They'll be okay because they have bottled water access, they have islands, they have the funds to escape to cleaner places, like they have. And if you think about it, I just know from my own experience traveling, when I compare the US to Brazil, for example, or like even Mozambique, one of the things that I miss all the time when I'm abroad is fresh air. And that's not saying much because the air quality in the US is, especially in major cities, is not the best. And it's getting exponentially worse like per year. But I would say that, when I think about like what places are already in a condition where it's basically what the US is going to become, all those places are in the global south. And so the question is like, how do we, I don't think we can impress upon CEOs that there's a problem because they can always go to some place that's cleaner in the meantime, right? Like they can vacation somewhere where they don't have to worry about dirty air quality and they don't have to worry about like not having access to clean water or having access to water, period, right? Because you and I were talking about the access to water question a couple days ago. But like, I don't think they have to worry about it. And so I think for them, it's like out of sight, out of mind. And they don't care what happens to the rest of us, right? They obviously already don't care what's happening in other parts of the world. So for them, I don't think there's ever going to be that moment of reckoning where it's going to matter, and they're always going to have an escape. Now, what happens to their kids is a different question, because I think after a while, obviously, we're not going to have an escape, a place to quote unquote escape to left on the earth. There's not going to be any place to go. But for them right now, I don't think they're worried about they just don't have a future. They're nihilists, basically. I mean, they don't have a vision for the future, except for passing money down, I guess. I don't know.
It feels like that's essentially been prevalent throughout Western society for decades now. Like, hey, I'm just going to make sure I give you guys enough. I'm going to give my family enough money so that they can get a nice bunker somewhere or a nice loft in the walled city or whatever, in the Amazon city or whatever they end up, the Comcast city or whatever it ends up being. And that's the plan, is essentially align yourself with the corporation that you think is going to end up in a powerful position in this post-apocalyptic hellscape.
And that also raises the question of growing militarism too. I mean, obviously militarism has not stopped. It's gotten increasingly worse in terms of U.S. military power. We just, this past year, every year they pass a bill for billions and billions and billions of more dollars to the U.S. military. And so then that makes you question too, like, okay, what's going to happen when we're at a point where we, as in people in the U.S. at least, are literally fighting tooth and nail for basic resources. And I'm not ignoring places like Flint and cities that don't have access to basic resources. I'm saying as a nation, as a whole, right? If we ever get to the point in upcoming future, in the recent future, what is the word? I can't speak English anymore, guys. I'm sorry. Like I don't know. What is the word that we say when like the near future?
Yeah, there we go.
The near future. I'm like the recent future. But yeah, the near future, when we're competing directly for these resources, I mean, think about what's going to happen when. I mean, it's just going to be calling the military, And I think we've already seen this happening in other parts of the world. And that's why all this discussion about population control is disgusting. Like, you've seen it, because every 5 seconds I see another article out by Bill Gates.
Right.
About how Africans need to stop having so many babies. Macron also gave a fucking ridiculous speech at the beginning of his presidency, not implying, but literally saying that like African women are having too many babies. Like, basically all these rich white men are saying, close your legs, African women. But the reality is, like, people in Africa, and they're talking specifically to sub-Saharan African people, they're not the ones weighing heavily on the environment. You know, it's like people who don't even have kids who live in the West, but who are incredibly wasteful. And I think and the other thing too that they don't think about is like the mortality rate in sub-Saharan African countries. And a lot of them is so high precisely because of war, starvation, military intervention, like all this shit that's happening with the US. Every 5 seconds, we hear another story about some soldier getting killed or whatever, disappearing. And you're like, I didn't even know we had a war going on there. What is happening? You know, like what? So I think that there's a real disconnect, or I mean, these wealthy people know what they're talking about. Not that I agree with them, but I'm saying they are aware of the fallacy in what they're saying. But they keep saying it anyway because they want to blame somebody else for the ills that they and their ilk caused. You know, it's not poor sub-Saharan African women who caused the fucking global environmental crisis. You know? I mean,
yeah.
Give me a break.
What's scary about that is that means that they've made their choice. Is like they know, you know, that the 70% of the problem is coming from them. They know that they control more wealth than the bottom 50%, and they know that, and so their solution is, well, we need less people. That's the problem. There's too many people.
Right.
It's like, no, it's a matter of distribution. Period. And
like, how many people have been saying this forever? Like, you remember in, like, I don't know, middle school history where you learn about Malthus and all these assholes in Britain during the Industrial Revolution who are like, gotta keep those poor people from breeding so much. Like, are you kidding me? It's 2018. We still have asshats saying this shit. Like, now. It's absurd.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. It makes me so angry. It's like, I can't.
Well, yeah, exactly. Anger and is like, and like I said, they've made their choice. It's like they've chosen not you. So it's like, if it comes down to it, they're saying, let people die. I'm not going to share more wealth. That's not how this scenario ends.
Exactly. And we've already, the worst part is that we've already seen these fucking experiments in action. Like, if you look at sterilization projects, that's what's going to be next. I guarantee it. We've already seen this before. But who did they sterilize? If you look at U.S. history of sterilization, you look at sterilization in Latin America, sterilization in Africa, sterilization in Asia. It's always poor women who are victims of this crap. And people with disabilities. So they had a huge, you know, like eugenics campaign in the U.S. for sterilizing people with mental disabilities, right? So like this is going to repeat itself. And they often try to dress it up in kind of a like, oh, everybody should have access to contraception and blah, blah, blah. But what did we see, for example, in Israel a few years back, African migrants to Israel? What were they doing? They were sterilizing them. They were giving them contraception that made them sterile. You know, oftentimes without any sort of educational program to tell them what was happening. And so I think that we're just going to see more of this on a mass scale, and that's going to be their solution. In the meantime, it's always going to be solutions that impact the most vulnerable communities and the most vulnerable countries who don't really have a say in what's going on, and they're going to dress it up as aid. Right? Like, we're helping them by giving them these plans, these medical sterilization plans. We're helping them. Like, no.
No, that's one of the reasons I really love the pedagogy of the oppressed, is it helped me wrap my mind around the oppressiveness of that, you know, style of intervention. And just how destructive and how it reinforces the oppressive structures that the people are suffering from in the first place. And, you know, it's like you know, Bill Gates is like, oh, you know, I'm going to help Africa. It's like, well, the only reason you can help Africa more than anybody else is because you're helping to exploit them and much of the world. So it's like, it's a perpetuation and a sick cycle of exploitation and then paternal aid, as they will call it aid, but in reality, it's just perpetuating the exploitation and reinforcing
and it's like, if you take 90% of what people have and then you give them back 10%, you're not losing anything. You're not aiding anyone. It's like, you're not helping them. You're giving them what they're technically owed. But then, I mean, in the case of like positive aid, I'm not talking about sterilization and things like that, but like medical equipment and medicine and things like that. Whenever they have these, you know, drop in like Clintons or Bill Gates or whoever, you know, these people that drop in and they come with their helicopters and crap and they drop a box and they say, congratulations, Africans, be happy that we're helping you. I mean, the reality is you're taking more than you're giving back, you know, like these people owe so many countries and so many communities for their wealth. I mean, literally, they've amassed wealth on the backs of all these people. And so the audacity for them to turn around and then say, you all need to stop producing. Now that we've taken everything that you've worked for, that all of you large quote unquote, large populations of people have done for us. Now we want you to stop reproducing, right? Like, now we've taken everything from you, all of your labor. So don't make any more, don't make any more people.
It's a global rehappening of not so different than what happened in the United States after, they felt that they were done with slaves.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
It was like, well, if y'all are going to make us allow you to be free people, we're just going to get rid of all of you.
Mm-hmm. And people thought, we put it in Marxist terms, they say, surplus population. It's literally the excess, right? So there's no more use for them. So the only use for them is now target practice. That's basically what it is,
And as they remain, they remain as a threat, and so the longer that they're allowed to manifest and to sit around, the more attractive they become to the other disenfranchised masses, and so they'll be shut down and gotten rid of in whatever ways are feasible depending on the circumstances. We saw Saudi Arabia with Khashoggi. And we've seen, other nations act in similar ways where, if you're too critical or you're getting too much attention, drawing too much attention towards the things that they don't want attention drawn towards, they'll do whatever it takes to hush you up.
That's another feature from our year in review with that particular man. At this point, I don't know what to say because it's so predictable, right? Like, we knew that the U.S. wasn't going to do anything about this man that they literally dismembered and killed, and it's all on tape. And I mean, it's like the blatant violence that was enacted upon him, and then the fact that there's no recourse, like there's no one's going to be held accountable for this because the U.S. and Saudi Arabia are allies. I don't think we're going to ever see anything change about this, at least not in the near future. In the recent future, as I said earlier. But I don't know, man. It's at this point, when I see these kinds of things, it makes you wonder, what is the reach of our power as voters, right? And what is the reach of our power, even as just basic citizens, voters or non-voters? What can we do in situations like that? Now, given it's just one individual, but then when you start to look at things like the war in Yemen, right, which was also something that I think in this year really kind of came to the fore, even though people have been talking about it since its inception, right? Mm-hmm. It's not like people didn't know about it when it was happening under Obama too. But I think this year, because it's happening under Trump, people are like, oh, we should start paying attention to that war over there that we've been funding for years and didn't do anything to stop. I don't know why. I guess just because of the blatant cruelty of it, but there's also blatant cruelty in the war that's been going on. I mean, they were blowing up school buses, for God's sakes. So why this one moment was the catalyst? And also, what is it that we can do as people who care? I mean, I don't know. I'm just kind of at a loss. When I see things like this that I know the U.S. responds, I get frustrated because I just feel like when it comes to foreign policy, there's very little that I as an individual can change, no matter how informed I am about what's happening. I don't know. What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I mean, you feel powerless sometimes as an individual when you see things like this happening, or with the war in Yemen is a good example. The blockading and the situation in Venezuela is another one where you see people that just want to live suffering for the sake of capitalism, for the sake of perpetuating imperialism, for the sake of protecting billionaires' bottom lines. And that it's disturbing and it feels overwhelming. There's a lot of details going on and nuance involved as well. But I think France, in the recent times, has given us some. It kind of gives me some hope. I mean, it depending on how it turns out, I think is going to impact things. And I mean, Yeah, and I mean, like, there's obviously, I've seen expressed the concerns about whatever movements transpiring in France. It's also uh, not taking any consideration of the global South. So the the level of comfort, the quality of life that people are looking to seek is still going to be dependent on the exploitation of people abroad. And so that in left movements across the West, I think that's been a common theme in that a lot of people's leftist and socialist beliefs stop at the border. And
Absolutely.
I think in any reading a theory, be it Marx or even people that have worked from then, I don't really see one where you can make it that way. I mean, I can understand smaller nations and ones that are coming up or being industrialized and so on and so forth, where they could have a different perspective. But from the United States perspective, uh, I I mean, you can't your socialism can't stop at the border. Otherwise, it's just better neoliberalism, basically.
Which brings us to yet another highlight, quote unquote, from 2018, during which we saw some leftists, quote unquote, who decided that being against migrants was a good idea, and that for whatever reason, we all of a sudden need to have rigid borders and inflict violence against people who are the victims of U.S. imperialism abroad. Thoughts, Richard?
Right.
I mean, this has been eye-opening for me, at least, because I never thought we'd get to the point where we had people going on Tucker Carlson and, first of all, didn't think I'd ever see leftists, quote unquote, on Tucker Carlson because he's basically a fascist, but also didn't think that I'd have to worry about self-proclaimed leftists being in favor of something that Tucker Carlson, which is a hard name to say for some reason for me. Tucker Carlson. Say that 20 times fast. I don't know. I mean, I never thought I'd see the day when people were claiming to be on the left and also claiming to being against being. I mean, because it's not that they're against migrants, but they are inevitably if you're saying that you want closed borders to the degree that they do. And I think it's kind of, I saw a lot of cherry picking of leftist ideology to defend what is basically the far right case against people of color from other countries.
If we're going to make an argument to close our borders, we better close them with our military on this side of them.
Yeah.
It's, like mentioned Africa earlier. It's like we say we have a light footprint in Africa with like over a dozen military bases.
I mean, it's absurd. It's completely. I mean, I as you said, if you're going to close the border, better bring back the military too, because they're everywhere. They're literally everywhere. And my point is, you can't complain about people coming here and talk about closing borders without also discussing the violence that's being inflicted upon them in our name with our tax dollars by our military. It's a complete disconnect that's intentional. You know what I mean? Like, these people know that. These people are fully aware of U.S. foreign policy, and they don't mention that in their little articles for right-wing magazines and right-wing TV shows when they talk about, people who are escaping violence that we're causing. They don't mention that part.
Mm-hmm. It's like, we burned down your house, but I don't know why you think you should be able to come over to ours.
Right, yeah. How dare you?
Right? Like, it's mind-blowing, and we see it repeated over and over in country after country, and with we've seen it repeated throughout this country's past. And like you said, it's disconcerting when you see it coming from self-proclaimed leftists that that they're embracing this type of view. And I guess to parry back a bit towards the concept of reviewing the years, the beginning of the year, I had this feeling, it was like I had the dejection of Bernie losing and feeling somewhat hopeless. Like, I mean, if we can't elect Bernie, which was uncomfortably to my right even then there isn't. The two-party system is not offering us a solution to those three catastrophic problems that I mentioned earlier. Like, they are not offering us a solution, period. It's just a matter of how either of them want to mitigate the damages for a select group of people within the United States. That's what's on the table in the current political spectrum, and that it's just unacceptable for me. And you mentioned it feels hopeless as an individual, but then I just look at some of the stories that we covered. Whether it's Castro's History Will Absolve Me, and I've done studying about Che Guevara as well, or when we talked like some of the Black Panther stuff that I've been looking at, or just some of the various, and then Carlos. I don't want to try and butcher his last name, but the Marigala, mini manual of the urban guerrilla. That was like when I read these things, I'm inspired. It's like their situations didn't seem much more hopeful than ours. And so looking at what it took to get from.
I'm so sorry. It's not my fault, guys. You hear the whole street in my apartment, so I'm so sorry for the man randomly revving his motor repeatedly in the background.
Okay,
anyway, keep going. I'm sorry.
The digital distortion made it unclear. It's like, did a group of people just manifest outside your door? Like suddenly there's people chanting outside. It's like, yeah, Wendy's right. It's like, we're recording this. They can't hear us live.
I'm so sorry, everyone. It's not my fault, but keep going.
I guess, but yeah, just seeing like their situations didn't seem much more hopeful than ours, and so seeing the thing that I saw then and has become ever clearer since then is just how critical and how important education is in that process. And I think one of the important things that I learned just most recently in Freire, although it's been mentioned going all the way back to, or at least it's back to Marx and Hegel, regarding dialectic, investigating, and the concept of establishing our truth and understanding through dialect, and not as Freire calls it, the banking model of education, or as other people have referred to it, and we talked about earlier, more of a paternalistic aid situation. It's not so much that we're going like, as I see myself, I don't consider myself, like an educator or anything like that, but in the sense of what we're doing here, we're going along and we're reading these and trying to help interpret these texts, at least as we see them for our audience. But what that means is that we're only part of this. Our engagement, our interpretations, our reading is only a part of it. We need to educate ourselves as well, and neither of us, those of you listening or us, what we're saying, we're not learning if we're not dialoguing, if we're not discussing it and finding our contradictions and identifying them and identifying themes and recognizing and talking through them, then we're not really getting closer to knowledge. If we just accept what somebody else tells us as knowledge without interacting with it ourselves, then what Freire and a lot of what I've read throughout the literature is that we're not really learning. We're not really, and it's also talked about with how the difference between theory and praxis, and that, if you're all theory or all praxis, that's problematic. That they have to be conjoined together in order to be effective and productive. And it's
sorry again, motors revving outside. I feel like I'm at like Formula One and I didn't know. I wasn't expecting Formula One today. So again, sorry everyone for the motors revving. Keep going, Richard.
But just so how important that is, and then that makes the people that like at least portray a genuine desire to improve the situation, be they socialist, communists, or closer to the neoliberal scale or side of the spectrum. If they want to make things better, then a dialectic engagement about how and why you can't just pour this information into people and expect the results that you're wanting and then how then do we engage and not think that we're like that, that there's a group of elites or of knowledgeable people that need to go and educate the unwashed masses, but that there's an unwashed masses, and there's working class, and there's bourgeoisie, and that we have things that we can learn from each other. And it's a bit, I don't know, out there from Frary, but and it reflects more how I feel though. But like that, if we love each other and we do this from a place of love, then we'll recognize that we're all suffering from an oppression, and that there's a benefit in it for all of us to lift all of us out of this oppression, whether no matter where you fall on that scale, either in the class side, politically, or anywhere else. Is that there, even if the quality of your life as you understand it, like how much water you can waste, or how much food you can waste, or how much fuel you can waste, like even if those things go down, and so you would presume that would be a lower quality of life, the what is life is the discovering of that knowledge, and the humanization of the individual, the that engagement in the social reality. And so whether you have a fancy mansion or you have a tin shack, it's being able to explore that I think people value, and that's why you can find people that are by all measurements happy living in some of the most, what to look like to us, the most atrocious conditions. And then you can see people in the United States living in the most posh and lavish lifestyles, and they're miserable. It's because they're not, the oppression that exists because of the system attacks all of us, and the freedom from it isn't just monetary. You don't achieve it. Just getting a certain comfort of life isn't enough to achieve that fulfillment and that happiness. And that is one of the biggest things that I've gained out of the year. And it's really helped me to understand how I can do something moving forward, is that, it's about raising people's awareness of our commonality and why we have to fight. And we see it manifesting a bit in France, where it runs the political spectrum, and it's not necessarily a far left movement. It's disregarding the global south, but it shows that people can identify the oppressor outside of themselves, given the circumstances. And it doesn't necessarily, like, the key point of the education is so that when it comes to the point of, well, what do you guys want? How do you guys want to fix this? Is that you get a solution that's not based in the same oppressive ideology that you're fighting.
So, see, this is why I like having you as a co-host for Reading Revolution, because you say things that are really profound, and I'm just kind of angry, and you're like, let's talk about, like, I feel like I'm listening to, the guy, oh God, I can't remember his name, but the guy who used to paint with the big fro.
Bob Ross.
Yeah, Bob Ross. You're like the Bob Ross of this podcast. So I really appreciate, as per usual, like everything you have to say. And I agree with what you said. I think my reservations about the, Gilets jaunes protests, yellow vest protests in France, is because I've seen so many protests in the past few years get co-opted, or even before they started, they were basically corporate protests. So, I mean, I'm not saying this yellow vest protest is corporate, but I'm just saying that I've seen so much co-optation of protesting, and I'm kind of burned from that. And I think that, because I saw what happened in Brazil, right, where a protest that started as very clearly left-wing became a right-wing monster pretty quickly, like within a month, more or less. And then that helped generate the sort of energy and support for right-wing candidates, for a coup, and then for the fascists that they had coming into office in January. It's hard for me right now. And even I think if you look at Ukraine, for example, some stuff that happened in Venezuela, like there's so many cases around the world where we've seen protests that started out one way and then went completely to another place in a very short period of time because of, external intervention, like certain funding measures and things like that. So it's very hard for me to see and want to say something, right? And so today I was actually reflecting on this protest, but also thinking more about what Macron was doing right after he got elected, that I think was really important and that a lot of people sort of overlooked. And most of the mainstream media was not talking about it because at that time they were still all fawning over Macron and talking about how great he was and how handsome he was. And oh my God, you know, like
neoliberalism isn't dead. Yay!
Right? Like, yeah, like he's gonna save the EU and like all this bullshit. And I think, you know, when we think back though to what was happening shortly after he got elected, he basically continued the violence and austerity that Hollande had put into practice in the banlieue, which is like the suburbs outside of the major cities. And in suburbs, in this case, for people who aren't as familiar with French geographic layout, which I don't expect very many people to be, but it's not, when we say suburbs, when we're talking about France and also in Brazil, funny enough, it's not like the white picket fence, middle class, big, like, you know, McMansion, 2 cars, garage, and a dog kind of situation. Like when we talk about suburbs in the US, when we say suburbs of major cities in places like Brazil and France, we're talking about predominantly poor, predominantly of color, marginalized in some other social way. So for example, in the case of France, a lot of the people who live in the suburbs are poor. They're migrants or children of migrants, many of which were former French colonies. So you're looking at North Africa, parts of sub-Saharan Africa as well, the Caribbean somewhat. And then also people who are economically deprived, and also sometimes made up of religious minorities. So in the case of France, for example, you have a large Muslim community that lives in these suburbs. And so basically, under Hollande, who himself was a socialist, quote unquote, he engaged in a lot of activity that involved extreme policing, limitation of civil liberties, and austerity against these communities. Also, France was under basically a state of emergency for a big chunk of time, leading into Macron's presidency because of several terrorist attacks. But then the president at the time, Hollande, sort of took advantage of that and extended those moments of quote unquote emergency for the long term. And so Hollande, once Macron took over, he basically instituted a law that was sort of like what we consider the Patriot Act in the U.S. It was very similar to that, and in terms of its limitations on people's rights. And of course, the police were going after more predominantly the people who lived in these suburbs. And so what's interesting when we think about, you know, the crackdowns and all these awful things that were happening to these people that are basically rendered invisible in France, despite having, you know, a fairly large part of the population. The U.S. press pretty much ignored what was happening to them. There are some things that I saw on Politico that I posted. There's also like a discussion on Democracy Now! But all of the major newspapers and magazines and things like that, it was sort of an afterthought. They'd have a little paragraph here, a little comment there, but for the most part, it was glowing praise of Macron. And so now it's interesting to kind of think about how they've been responding to this yellow vest protests, which I don't want to say that the U.S. press has been exactly favorable, but they have been covering it a lot, right? And it's just kind of fascinating to me that there was pretty much like very little regard for what was happening in the lead up to this, that I think once you trace back to what was being said and done in the earlier stages of his presidency, you can really kind of okay, now it makes sense what's happening now, you know, even though these people that are, it seems like a very mixed group of people too. That's why I also have been very cautious about assessing it. Like I've been kind of hanging back and watching things as they develop, because on the one hand, I see reports that they're right wingers. On the other side, I see that they're Antifa people present. You know, I can't get a hold of what the makeup of this protest is. I don't know. I just know it's against Macron, which like good for them because Macron is awful.
Yeah.
But I don't know from what angle, you know?
I think I mentioned earlier that neoliberalism is providing a window for the rise of neo-fascism or for fascism. And
Sure.
like part of that is because this policy, I mean, either side of the political spectrum could advocate the policy, the triggering policy that is being credited for the issues in France with the gas taxes. Like, that could have come out of either side of the political spectrum, but because it's coming out of neoliberalism, that's the face that it's getting, and so it enrages or motivates people on the right who are going to be inclined towards fascism, and fascism plays well towards the billionaire system, just because it's a lot easier to replace a fascist with a fascist that, you know, is favorable to you than it is to try to replace a democratic population with a democratic population that's favorable to you. If the population just isn't favorable to you, and they've arrived there as a democratic decision, that's a lot different than if, you know, some fascist has made you out to be the enemy, and now the new fascist that you've replaced them with is like, oh, actually, they're the reason we're getting all these billions of dollars in funding. Like, versus as opposed to trying to convince the people is like, no, I promise you that these big U.S. corporations coming into our country are here to help us.
Right. Not quite, guys.
But I do have some people that I talk to that are in France, and they have reflected back to me that it is a large mixed group of people, and to some effect that what you're seeing now, the yellow vest aspect of it, is a lot of those types of policies and the austerity impacting the people that thought that they were going to be left out of it, and now they're losing their shit. You know, like, and it is like, and because it's a segment of the population that is traditionally considered the good people, as opposed to, you know, if it was a bunch of migrants out there saying the exact same thing and having longer suffered the same circumstances, it would be the idea of it being a riot would be much more, you know, oh, this is totally out of control. These people are, you know, rather than being embraced by the right as a resistance to neoliberalism, is how you're seeing it portrayed, and particularly in the U.S. and right wing media. That, oh, this is people lashing out against neoliberalism in favor of conservatism and lower taxes and so on and so forth. It's like, no, a large portion of the people support the idea of, you know, limiting greenhouse emissions by taxing. The problem is how taxes always roll downhill to the people that have the least ability to pay them. And so, like, that's the unifying thing, is that everybody can agree that they're all getting screwed over by this group of people who say that they're trying to make the situation better, but they want to do it off the back of the working class. And so that unifying factor, I think, is right. But I mentioned earlier how important education is because there's a Fred Hampton clip about it. But essentially, if the people are educated, they'll say that they hate the oppressor, instead of in the United States, oftentimes, and from our perspective, the white man or whatever, the white billionaire. But if you hate the oppressor, and rather than you making a target of a particular group based off of some superficial feature, then when it comes to finding solutions or improving the situation, you find improvements to the situation rather than just renegotiations of the broken system.
Right. And that's my concern in this case. I mean, and what I've seen in so many other protests that were co-opted.
And in fairness, that's where it looks like this is going to end up heading. And where the United States, like, they see in the U.S. that there's a movement growing of energized people, and what they want to do is they want us to burn ourselves out and get brought back into the fold. And the way that they do that is through this, by giving us an action to unite around, but then making sure in situations such as in France that the unity is so fragile that once it collapses, it gives them the opportunity to come back in and offer to be the saviors by re-implementing the same things that you guys were just fighting against.
Right.
And that goes throughout history before we even had democracies or anything like that, when people just revolt.
Yes. Of course. I think too that, like, one of the reasons why I've been sort of hesitant to really wade into this discussion on the Yellow Vest protest is also just because I hate to be this person, right? Like, I know this is like a tired response, but I'm just going to say it anyway. Like, I'm exhausted from people completely ignoring protests when the people who are at the forefront are people of color. Because as you were kind of hinting at earlier, like when it's the most oppressed, like poor people of color out in the streets, it's a riot then, right? Everyone is violent. The police have a right to crack down. Any sort of negative response to them is justified. And it's also never, there's been a lot of really good writing about, for example, the Haitian Revolution, where for the longest time, no one would acknowledge the Haitian Revolution as a revolution. There was this complete disavowal of it being a revolution because it was slaves, right? It's like these black slaves don't know what the hell they're doing. They're just doing something to kill time. They're just being violent like how they always are, right?
Yeah, it'll pass too. It'll pass. Like eventually we'll get it back under control. Right. Like there's no intellectual underpinnings of this. It's just people being like animals that they are, right? And I think that unfortunately that kind of thought still pervades when it comes to protests that's waged by people of color, because I remember very clearly when there were protests in the suburbs that I was talking about before of Muslims, Arabs, Black people from African countries, etc. And they were rioting, quote unquote. They weren't protesting for their rights. They were rioting, right? Because there had been several instances of police violence against people who live in those kinds of communities. We saw this in England too, where there were quote unquote riots in the poor outskirts of London. And the response from the press was not, oh, look at those people, fighting for their rights. It was, look at these animals tearing down and burning up their communities. And I think that there's a real, even hell, I live in Baltimore, you know what I mean? Like, even when I think about, I wasn't in Baltimore during the time of the Freddie Gray protests, but I remember seeing on the news for sure, the language around the response of poor Black people in Baltimore who have been oppressed for centuries at this point, like literally they're dealing with police violence nonstop. It's bad, Richard. Like and I think we see on the news is like one thing, but when you live there and you realize the extreme economic disparities and resource disparities between one community that could be a block away from the other one, it's very clear. And I think for me, reflecting back on those protests at that time, now that I live there, a lot of things make more sense, just seeing the sort of spatial segregation and violence that people have to deal with who live in these communities. But I think that, there's never a full recognition of protests as an intellectual endeavor or anything like that when it's done by people of color, predominantly of people of color. It's just never acknowledged. And I think that's why for me, in some ways, I have been, and also just because I've been burned from like seeing protests being co-opted by the right, I've just been kind of hanging back because I'm like, I think it's important for us to understand that, that, or not understand, but just reflect on like when we decide to recognize something for what it is, as opposed to downplaying the meaning of it, the significance of it, just because of the people's bodies that are out in the street. What color are those people, right? What are their backgrounds? Not even just like a question of race, but also the socioeconomic backgrounds. Because I think this idea of the working class, right now I hear a lot of people talking about, these are French workers and blah, blah. Well, okay, so the people who were protesting in the banlieue a couple years ago weren't? Like, are they not working? They're just all like slogs, you know what I'm saying? So the way even the language that I think people don't, it's not intentional, you know what I'm saying? But it's completely reflecting a bias, I think, that people have towards one group of people protesting versus another group of people protesting. Even when we saw like the protests against Trump, when we had the J20 protests versus the Women's March. And I think there were images of people at the Women's March in different parts, not the DC one, I don't think, but at different women's marches, the smaller ones around the country, where they were like shaking hands with police and taking pictures of police. And it's like, same thing happened here in Brazil. There were lots of cases of like right-wing protesters taking pictures with police, and then you see the other protests when they were predominantly left-wing, and they were getting beaten by the police. So there's a real, there's a disconnect, and in terms of the framing of the protests, and for me personally, like I like to have a
better understanding of what's going on before I weigh in on anything. But I think that's why I've also sort of been hesitant to express any sort of like, oh yeah, this is great, because I don't know really what's going on. And I also, I'm always skeptical when I see people who were not necessarily paying attention or interested when stuff was happening to poor people of color and who are migrants in these other places. When I don't see the same kind of interest expressed there, but like all of a sudden who are enthusiastic about what's going on now when it's a different set of faces, it makes me wary. Like I'm kind of like, I don't know. Maybe I'm completely wrong. It's still just kind of...
You actually, I mean, all that kind of reminded me of several things. I mean, you mentioned the crackdown that was going on in these communities, and essentially it looked a lot, or was similar to what was going on in New York right after 9/11, where basically the lines of civil liberties and, in our case, the Fourth Amendment right, were being blurred or disregarded altogether, and communities were reacting to that.
Right.
When you're invading us, and and then assuming guilt in places like, oh, you said negative things, you must have been part of this thing, because they were also dealing with their own a couple terrorist attacks or whatever, however you want to phrase it, that they were responding to, and so they were questioning families and invading people's lives in a way that it's hard for Americans, I think, that haven't been in a community that's been cracked down on like that, to even really understand or kind of imagine. It doesn't seem like something that would happen in the modern world, as far as it's portrayed. It seems more like something out of a dystopian movie, but the
dystopian movies are always based on current day reality, right? So that's
but you mentioned the not caring is like, it's the same people that are waiting on bated breath for the next thing that Mueller's going to tell them. Didn't care when Mueller was a part of that in New York, or Comey was a part of that in New York, like the thing, or any of the things that they had done to oppress and abuse disadvantaged communities in this country or globally. Like they're participated in and or personally responsible for some atrocious things that the FBI or was involved in at the time, or whichever respective agency, in Mueller's case, it being an attorney in New York, and so on and so forth. Like there's just so many different aspects of this that, like, all the overlapping, and that's one of the things we've been teasing, the pedagogy of Oppresso, and I'm going to go ahead and say, if you only read one thing that we've covered this year for Reading Revolution, this would be the one that I would pick. And if you start reading it and it gets difficult, and if you could only read one page, I would suggest reading the first page of chapter 2. And like, yeah. Well, for me, it was just like in school, I recognized this picture, the banking model of education, and the contradiction that it presented with the constant calls for us to think for ourselves, think out of the box, be imaginative, all these types of things. Like, well, but whenever we question anything that you tell us, you just tell us, no, write it down, remember it, it's going to be on the test. Like, I was like, well, wait a minute, did Christopher Columbus discover America? Weren't there people here? Oh, well, don't worry about it. He discovered it here. It's like, well, did he even land in the United States? No, don't worry about it. It's like if we don't have that dialogue, then we're not really learning. We're just regurgitating information, and most of it doesn't stick. And what does stick is just the systemic stuff and problems that we see or manifest in the ways that it does. And it's just like, so being able to make connections between different things. So like I said, with the Tuesdays with Maury, with the pedagogy, with the what's going on in the US, what's going on for all these connections, that's my drug of choice. Like, is finding material that does that. And so the pedagogy of the press really connected a lot of things for me and gave me clarity. And I mentioned a little bit before, kind of gave me a conceptualization of how you explain to the people that are in power that this situation is actually bad for them. Like,
yeah, that's a hard thing to do, but necessary for sure.
Yeah, we're not. They're never going to buy. Like the two options are, killing them or getting them to buy into to a representation of the world where them losing wealth is a good thing for them, bringing them closer to fulfillment and happiness. Is like, if you can't make that case, then your only other option is to kill it and take it. Those are your options. Like, I mean, I guess you can imprison them, but that's just building a revolution in your prisons. So like. And you, like, as Hampton says, you can jail a revolutionary, but you can't jail a revolution. And so, as many times as they try and kill these ideas, they try and bury them. They try to, burn them in books. The literal case, it's like the concepts, the ideas are in us, like deep within us. And so, even if we have to keep remaking them and keep re-envisioning them. For each individual circumstance, it's more core to us than the propaganda, the capitalistic propaganda that they paint on top of it, and the colonization in our minds that invades our every thought. It's deeper than that. So if we find the right tools, we find the right methods, we can reach that. I believe. In just about anybody. Obviously, there's people with various circumstances, genetic, brain trauma, and so on and so forth, in which case there are certain limitations to what their brains are actually capable of. But I think for most of us, most of the population, they're deep within us is a core belief that we're entitled to a humanity and dignity, and that others are too. And if we can reach that, even in the people that have made it their life's work to exploit those same people, that we can find solutions where we can stave off as many deaths as possible in those upcoming situations. That, like, because I mean, the situation as it lies, I mean, without significant scientific breakthroughs, there's just no way to stop at least 1 billion climate refugees, right. 1 billion people without access to potable water, and the energy crisis with people where, simply China can't imitate our lifestyle, and the world won't sustain it. It's just not possible. So there's got to have to be some sort of meeting between where how a rural Chinese person lives and how an affluent American lives. We're gonna have to meet somewhere in the middle, or the world's gonna solve the problem for us and get rid of us.
I just have one more comment that I have to make about the yellow vest thing, because I can't let it go. So not to totally derail the conversation again, but I think one of the other problems that I have is just that because I don't, again, I'm not trying to say that like this entire movement is white and middle class or upper class or whatever, because I don't think that's the case. But I would say for sure, in terms of the media representation of this protest that's going on in France, in the United States, the way it's being framed is sort of like, these are disgruntled lower middle class and middle class white workers. And I don't know enough about the breakdown, the demographic breakdown, even the class breakdown of the movement, because I think what we're getting on the US end is going to be distorted off, on its face anyway, just because it's the US mainstream media. So I'm not trying to say that like, I don't care about this movement because it's white. But what I do want to say is that it bothers me that I guess what I'm trying to say is like the press representation of the movement bothers me more than the movement itself. So the movement itself is one thing, but I think the representation that we have of it in the West, or at least in the US, to be more specific, is one that excludes and sort of writes off a lot of these previous protests that have been happening for a minute now since Macron has come into office, that all of a sudden they care about this one. Gives me pause. That's I guess the best way of putting what I mean. Because I think if it had been that, every day on the news, we turned on the TV and we saw the French police raiding people's houses and breaking up families and like kidnapping people basically from their community, it would be different. Like, I would be like, okay, this is awful. Like, we need to, what is that noise? Oh my God. I'm so sorry, everyone. Like, literally, so no matter, in Brazil, it's like, if you're in a major city, no matter what floor you're on, you're going to hear everything outside. You don't hear your neighbors necessarily, but you hear everything that's going on outside for some reason. Like, I don't know what the deal is. But anyway, I apologize for all the noise. but yeah, I think that's where I am right now. I'm frustrated that we have not seen nearly as much concern, and we know why. We know very well why, of certain communities in France that have been going through it for a long, long time, and that have been completely ignored, or at least, not considered a group that's worthy of caring about. And I think they're kind of, as per in the United States, the canary in the coal mine, to be honest, because this is happening well in advance to them. And it was happening even before Macron came into office, right? Like, austerity was hitting the poor migrant communities in France for a long time. It's not new for them. And so I think it's frustrating for me that all of a sudden I'm supposed to flip my concern for a group that's been marginally and had some sort of power, and a group that also sometimes engaged in and voted towards the further marginalization of these other groups that were being harassed early on and then ignored. I don't know if I'm making sense, but it's just sort of frustrating. I think people have the right to protest and have the right to be angry at what's going on, but it just makes me wonder, like, why was there less attention paid when it was happening already? Like, all the stuff that's happening to larger groups in France was happening to a smaller group that those same groups that are protesting now have been antagonizing for decades,
Well, I see the same parallel in a lot of leftist movement, and I think one of the things that is so troublesome is that it definitely seems as though if the concerns of this new, whiter, more middle class groups are alleviated, then it'll go right back to how it was, where the black or brown or the minorities are being oppressed, and the middle class somehow can't see what the big deal is.
Right. And I mean, even there was a really good interview that I posted earlier today from a guy who's often on Democracy Now! And he was very careful to mention that even under Jean-Luc Mélenchon, who's the lefty leader who ran against Macron and Le Pen back in that election and lost, unfortunately, people were kind of saying that he's like the Bernie Sanders of France. I hate these kind of reductive comparisons, but that's what they were calling him, for lack of a better term, I guess.
Us USNs don't know anything about anything else in the world, so you have to make it as simple as possible for us.
Right, like Bolsonaro is the Trump of Brazil, and Mélenchon is the Bernie of France. So, yeah, but I think, there was all this discussion about how he's this great lefty and blah, 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 but what people were ignoring about him, and then also there was a situation with a guy in Russia named Navalny, who was also sort of, both of these men were sort of being fashioned as like an alternative left candidate, and unfortunately they both had very bad sort of nativist policies, or not policies, but at least Navalny did for sure, but Mélenchon expressed support of the burqa ban, like basically it's called shorthand the burqa ban, but the ban on women wearing headscarves in public positions. So like, you can't work for the state and wear a headscarf, and like there were all these instances of Muslim women who are more conservative being harassed for wearing head coverings or wearing bikinis and things like that. I don't know if you remember this, but he was in support of that stuff. And like those kinds of, I mean, that kind of legislation meant everyday harassment for the same people that I'm talking about who lived in these outskirts of France, or obviously within outskirts of Paris, but obviously within Paris too. And so it's just very frustrating. I think when we, at least in the US, I think we fashion sometimes these foreign nominally left leaders as our saviors, but in fact, people don't reflect on how those leaders also engage with marginalized communities within their country. And when I say marginalized, I'm not just talking about economically, but I'm also talking about, socially marginalized on the basis of race, religion, migration status, etc. That matters. And I think that's one of the problems that I have with what I'm starting to see, at least on the online lefts in the US. I don't know if it's reflective of anything greater than that, because I've been out of the US for so long lately. But I think that there is a real concern, for me at least, that some people are starting to, or if they haven't been expressive of it before, but now are expressing it very loudly, that they don't want to talk about those other people anymore. They don't want to talk about like the most marginalized. They just want to leave everything at the level of class. And I know some people refer to this as class reductionism, but I feel like it's worse than that. Like, it's not just class reductionism, but it's also a type of antagonism, to be honest, towards people and communities that are marginalized on the basis of compound issues. So not just class, but also other social and identity-based elements that then limit their access to class equality, limit their access to economic equality. These things matter. And so, yeah, I think I don't think it's healthy for us to ignore when candidates or, I don't know, journalists or whomever decide that they're going to throw the otherized group under the bus. That doesn't help. In my opinion, it doesn't help us better reach class or economic equality. That's not how it works, you know. And it's this idea that if everything's okay for most people, then it'll be okay for everyone. It's like I don't understand the logic of that. You know, I've never heard anything like this in my life being forwarded as an actual ideology that has had any success. What I've always heard and what I believe in is that you help the absolutely most oppressed and most marginalized. And once those people are at a level where they are equal and where they have equality within a society, then, you know what I'm saying? It's an inverse. So a lot of people use this like like a rising tide raises all boats. But no, that's not true. Like you gotta pull out the boat that's sinking, that's all the way at the bottom first. You know, that's like the emergency.
Rising tide doesn't help the guy in the boat with a hole in it.
Right, exactly. Like you got to help that guy first. You know, you have to prioritize. If anything, you have to prioritize that as an emergency because he's already going to sink. He's already sinking, right? And if you don't want that guy to drown, you got to help him first. Deal with the other boats later, or come up with a method that will help all of them, but that prioritizes that guy. Right? Because he's in the most dire situation. And I think that there has been some sort of, I don't know where it's coming from, but it seems to me that some people believe that, and it goes against all fact, it goes against all reality that has been lived and experienced and written about and everything. But for some reason, I think it's coming into favor in a way that I find detrimental to leftist movements in countries that are made up of multiple groups. It's not just, you know, everybody's the same. And there are very few countries left like this, right? Yeah. So it's not realistic and not right, period.
And I mean, that's what I hear when I see the Green New Deal. It's like, oh, okay, I get it, you guys, and, you know, marketing and all that. It's like, but do we remember what happened with the first New Deal? Like who got left out of that one?
And the thing is it's not the plan itself. It's not always the plan itself, right? Because on paper, all these plans are fine. The issue is the implementation of these plans. And that's why we have to always have, I think, you know, secondary levels to these plans that ensure in practice when they are applied, that they're equally applied. And that they are and as I said, you know, as I've argued in the past, some of these plans are going to have triage clauses. That's what I like to call them, triage clauses, because they've got to help the people who are affected and in the most dire positions first. What that looks like may differ depending on the society, but I think that there have to be additional safety nets built in for instances where, you know, in practice, like you can't look at me in the face today and tell me that in Mississippi, an application of a New Deal is going to be fairly applied to people of color, for example, because you know that's not the truth. So there has to be an extra layer to these kinds of plans that ensures that people aren't being left behind and further marginalized just on the basis of their being poor and Black or poor and Muslim or fill in the blank, right? In parts of the country, or hell, the whole country, that have clear issues with racism, sexism, Islamophobia, fill in the blank, that limits people from having economic equality, I should say.
And that's why I think one of the reasons why I think the dialectic aspect is so important is, like, if you're not communicating with those communities, then you're like, you can look at every statistic you want, but you can't like definitively say that the situation is improving unless you're talking to the people, and that's what they're perceiving. It's like, because it's their reality. It's how you feel about what it's like in Africa isn't really as relevant as how somebody in Africa feels about living in Africa. we have to.
What are you trying to say, Richard? I'm just kidding.
Well, no. I mean, I think. That was actually super. That just reminded me of that you helped remind me that when I was we talked a little bit about some of this stuff before we started recording, and that like a lot of the things that concern me about life in the United States is already a reality for a lot of people around the world.
Right. Yeah.
And it's easy if I know if I can get distracted and lose track of that it's just as easier for somebody who's less aware of it as in a normal situation to lose track of what does a Green New Deal mean for Africa? What does whatever policy we're going to implement, what does that mean for humanity as a community of this world? And I think it's too easy for us to be like, well, this is what that group needs. They don't know, it's like they need democracy, or these people need this, and it's like, and if we give it to them, then things are going to get better. But that's just not how these things work. You can't give those things to people. They have to want them and take them for themselves. And people take independence, liberty for themselves when they understand what it means, when they understand the contradiction between their life and what a free life would be, and what liberation actually looks like. And that doesn't mean getting to do whatever you want whenever you want, and to hell with the consequences. It means together working towards becoming more complete as a human being, both on your own and then as a community. And so we see how capitalism interferes with that at nearly every turn, whether it be the banking model of education, whether it be the fascist model of the workplace, or it be any other the similarly dictatorial leadership of most kids' education. We see these manifest in all different aspects of our life, and recognizing it and then identifying it and then discussing with the people that are suffering from it is the only way that we're going to be able to reduce the suffering for all of us. If we're only looking at things through how it's going to affect us and the people that we immediately care about, and we keep our circles of empathy as small and close as possible, then we're just going to shift the suffering from one group to another. And that's not what any group wants. We want the suffering to stop, and or to be reduced, to be minimized, to be mitigated to the best degree that we can. And that takes a unity and a commonality of goals, and understanding that capitalism and imperialism act directly against, because that type of engagement with a social world threatens their existence.
I mean, I agree with all of that, except I do think that there are some groups that do intentionally want to continue to harm, and I think get off on harm.
Yeah.
And I think, exist on a level that is purely masochistic, or sadistic, purely sadistic. And I think a lot of them are in office right now, unfortunately, in political office. And yeah. I don't know if, I don't know. And this is my year in review, right? My year in review was, I spent half the year out of the country. So I was looking at the country from another country. You know what I mean? Like, I'm looking at the U.S. from, as I do in the U.S., right? Like, looking at the U.S. through Twitter, basically. Looking at the U.S. through the news. So it wasn't that different from how I see the U.S. when I'm in the U.S., but I've always noted that, like, whenever I'm out of the U.S. seems so much worse. And you really start to recognize how, like, bonkers the U.S. is on so many different levels. And I think also just having so many interactions with people who are angry at the U.S., understandably, who sometimes took out their anger initially towards me, even though I'm like, I'm one of the oppressed people in the U.S. So, like, don't be mad at me. Like, I agree with you, still having to confront in very real terms what the U.S. has done abroad and the effects of the damage in real time. And then also looking at what's happening in the U.S. We had so many white supremacist attacks this year in the US. And, you know, like I'm sitting here writing about Brazil and talking about the fascism in Brazil growing and all this stuff. And I'm just like, oh my God, like, what am I talking about? You know, Brazil has its work cut out for it. But look at the US. Like, the US has been under a state of siege for certain communities for forever, like since the beginning. You know, I don't think that we can say that indigenous communities or Black communities have ever had a break, right? I don't think there's ever been a moment in which the state was not doing something against those communities and wasn't doing it. And even, you know, we can get into further detail, like smaller communities within those communities. Obviously, they're not monoliths, but I mean, in general, from inception in the United States, indigenous and Afro-descended peoples have been victims of the state. And I think that it's hard for me, it's hard for me to kind of like look at the U.S. and even see a space of optimism. And this is why I say, like, I'm the one who's always yelling, and like Richard is the one who like brings me down to kind of say, hey, it can be better. Like, things can get better when you calm down, you know. But I am
mostly just trying to convince myself, but go on.
Yeah, no, but it's important. Like, I think we have to have, you know, an optimistic side. But I think just being outside of the U.S. and looking at the U.S. and looking at the state it's in, and I think this is also why I get more frustrated when I see leftists or self-proclaimed leftists, because I don't think they're real leftists, but self-proclaimed leftists siding with these monsters and siding with these people who are killing people like me and you, and saying we got to listen to them, and basically mimicking Trump's "they're good people on both sides," but like a left version of that, quote unquote left version of that. I mean, it's an affront to reality, right? And I think that for me to see the left in the US, it's never really been like what it needed to be in the first place. But like, we had a moment of hope, I think, in 2016, and in the aftermath, we started to see people really like popularizing socialism and all of that. But what I'm seeing right now is a regression, and I am really disappointed at basically what I see as kind of a squandering of what could have been a much more impactful moment of leftism in the US. I think some people were grifters, and I think a lot of people just wanted to make money. And so they looked at the Bernie moment and they said, oh, I'm going to get famous from this. I'm going to, you know, start my magazine or my podcast or whatever the F, and then use that, unfortunately, to turn into a weapon against the left. And I see a lot of this happening. And that's concerning to me. And I know that there's a lot happening on the ground that is more hopeful. And I think that does give us some sense of the left actually being put into action and working. But I am hoping that going forward, that sense of motivation that's coming out of these groups on the ground continues, and that they aren't hampered by the people that I see who are basically stressorites, or who are, you know, like siding with the right to a degree that's detrimental and dangerous for our movements, and in particular dangerous for people who are already marginalized on the basis of not the basis of their identities, but the basis of a state and a society that oppresses people on the basis of their identities. I always have to be careful about that, because it's not the identities that are causing the problem. It's the fucking racists and violent people and the state that are causing the problem, you know.
Right. Not fall into this. Well, if you just ask the racists in a better way, then they wouldn't be so racist. No, that's not how this works.
It doesn't work like that, you know. And so I think that to me is really mind blowing, because we saw, for example, a synagogue that was shot up. We saw, you know, the Charleston church that was shot up in 2015. So again, I'm one of those people who's like, this shit didn't start with Trump. It's been ongoing, like, since inception. But I think just seeing all this violence, you know, Standing Rock, again, ongoing for years, really, before people started to actually pay attention and then say something about it. And even then it was like, there are good people on both sides, but like from the Democrats, they were saying that with Standing Rock, you know, there are good people on both sides. And so it's just, it's mind blowing to me that right now we have people who are reflecting and I guess empathizing with the side of the oppressor, the very explicit and obvious oppressor. And I don't know what to say to them other than I think that those people are harmful. And I don't know if they have some other motivation, like if they're being paid to act like this, if they have, you know, I think some of them might be. But, you know, and I see so much of this strange defeatism too that's coming from some pundits on the quote unquote left who are saying, you know, don't fight white supremacists. There's no point, and there's no point for Antifa.
Oh, yeah.
And I'm just like, are you kidding me? So we're just supposed to sit here and get slaughtered? Like, is that the ideal? Like, you just want us to die? Is that we shouldn't fight? I mean, that's the same message that we hear from milquetoast liberals. So what is, I guess my point is, like, what is the point of being a leftist if your entire philosophy and ideology is based in cowardice? That's not what leftism is about, right?
Right.
And leftism is about confronting the violence that is enacted upon us and ending it through whatever means necessary, you know, whether the institutional, personal, you name it. But we have to fight back. And I don't know what's going on, but I'm really kind of, personally, I'm frustrated, and I hope that my frustration is alleviated by these people disappearing into the ether and no longer having a platform. I don't know what it's going to take, but I've seen a lot of this, and I'm not just talking about Twitter, I'm talking about people who have columns, and who are influential, and we don't. That to me is not the way we need to go.
It seems as though the grifter classes, you know, I'll articulate it now, but like essentially there's in like a lot of a group of so-called leftists have essentially looked at neoliberalism and they're pulling, you know, Samuel is like, what's the matter, Master? We sick? You know, like, what we gotta do, man? So how we gotta fix this? And they're looking at their oppressor and figuring out, how do we rebuild this relationship in a way that you can still oppress me, but that we're both in a more accepting, we're both more accepting of the situation, as opposed to we need to destroy this oppressive system. Period. End of story. Like the suffering, like whether it's the suffering or it's the unrealized potential or some combination of the two that motivates you, it's all unacceptable. Like the lost, the squandered potential of all those children in, you know, whether it be Yemen, Africa, and South America, or wherever, that they have tons of potential. They could be helping humanity move forward in both our understanding of ourselves and progressing towards a more peaceful and habitable world. Except instead, they're walking 3 miles a day to get water and working as a 12-year-old, reshoeing old shoes from the resoling old shoes from some other country that get dumped there into a dump that they spend 6 hours a day, you know, going through so that they can find resources to build their, you know, radio thing because they like gadgets or what. Like, that's what they're doing instead, because we've built a system that wants to exploit everyone, even if there's the potential there. So for people on the right, I think it's easier for them to get closer to recognizing the humanity of all people through understanding all the lost potential. And I think for a lot of people on the left, it's easier to empathize with the suffering and recognize that we have to do something to stop the suffering. But really, both of them are important, and we're not going to move forward without recognizing how much we're all losing because of that.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think, for example, that, well, maybe they do. Never mind. I was going to say, I don't know how much white middle-class people or even upper-class people have to gain from white supremacy, but who am I kidding? They have plenty to gain. Whether or not it's materially successful, I mean, even then, materially, they have a lot to gain, because if you keep people who are different from you from joining the workforce, if you keep them from feeling safe in public places and thus being consumers, right? Like, if you're looking at it from a right-wing perspective, I don't know. But I wish that more people understood how this oppression towards groups that are more vulnerable, for example, than even I am. If I look and I say, okay, someone who's poorer than me, or who doesn't have XYZ resource or whatever, who doesn't have access to healthcare, et cetera, they're in a dire situation. But I, for example, don't understand someone who's like in my position who can then look at them and say their suffering helps me somehow. Their suffering is like what I need to get what I want. And it's a mentality that I don't understand. But I know that some people have it. You know what I mean? Like, and I think even if they don't individually have it, they support states that enact that kind of policy that basically reflects that kind of mentality. Because there's this idea that, I mean, even when we hear things about, the military, like they're fighting for our freedoms. So, okay, so you're destroying other countries, if not entire continents, for what freedoms exactly? Like, I haven't seen any new amendments added to the Constitution. I haven't seen, you know what I mean? Like, I haven't seen anything that's like a direct effect from this violence and harm and clear destruction that's going on. This one-to-one relationship doesn't exist. But I think that some people really believe in that. And so they continue to support it because they believe that for us to have rights, we have to engage in destruction and suffering of others, of other communities, of other groups, of other countries. And I think that also is in play in the United States between some people. You know, I really do think that they think that, okay, if we imprison more people from this XYZ community, then we'll be safer. I mean, or if we keep these people from having access to healthcare, then my personal healthcare will be better because there will be more resources for me. I think people think like that. The question is, how do we reach those people? And how do we, and I think it's that this is what's hard to break down. Like, if you don't see other people as equals or as potential equals, right? And when I say potential equals, I mean in the sense that, like, at one point they should have the economic equality to be your equal, right? Like, we should, I think some people believe that this process involves their losing something in order for the other person to gain basic ass equality. Like, I think and I've heard this before. Like, I was during the 2016 election, someone who will remain unnamed said to me she didn't want to eat cat food for other people to have health care. Because for her, you know, other people having universal health care meant that she would have to suffer somehow. And that she was going to have to pay so much in taxes that even though she was making $100,000 a year, that she would have to pay so much in taxes that she would be eating cat food. And she's saying this to me, who's making like $25,000 a year as a fucking grad student. You know, I'm like, Are you kidding me? Like, you're worried about eating cat food so that a poor person can have basic health care and won't die? And you're talking about that? Like, are you kidding me? But yeah, I think people think like that. And I don't know how to make those people realize that, like, their continued oppression of other people also affects them. It's very difficult to connect those dots for some people, you know?
Well, one place that I can see how that kind of played out a little bit that we can look back on now is in sports, where essentially you had white mediocrity celebrated in sport through segregation. I mean, you know, essentially you had mediocre white people being celebrated as the best in the world because they excluded the rest of the world that would beat them. And so, like, when in the 60s and through the 70s into the 80s, and it even happens, like, I can't remember the exact comment that comes to mind, but there was some coach that recently said something to the same effect. But basically, the athletes were looking around. You know, you would get like a really high quality athlete, somebody that was at the peak of their ability, and then they would look around at their team, and they would be surrounded by mediocre people, and they were like, "What is this? Why am I surrounded by this mediocrity?" And they started to realize, oh, it's because. Oh.
Speaking of sports.
They realize it's like, oh, it's because we're excluding the people that are better than them based off of how they look. And so we saw in sport that, you know, I did a Mitt Romney in sport. No, but in sports we saw that you know, especially coaches, you know, they were looking around, going around the country, like looking for the most talented players to bring onto their team. And we're like, oh man, this guy's really talented. And then they'd see the color of his skin and be like, well, damn, too bad I can't have him on my team. Like, I'm gonna have to draft this mediocre white guy instead. And so, like, I think that's one way people see it, is like when you think about the incompetence that you see at work, and your bosses and the boss's boss who doesn't really seem to understand anything that's going on, but just seems to be in charge of everything for some reason. It's like, that's a result of this oppressive celebration of white mediocrity, like that's and of class
mediocrity
warfare.
period. I don't even think it's about white mediocrity. It's just about mediocrity period.
It is now. I mean, it's become more diverse now. Yeah, and that's what the liberalism has pushed us towards, is a shallow well, if we put black faces on it, it'll be better. It's like, no, that like, you can paint it. You can paint it any color you want. It's going to be the same thing.
Yeah. Yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry. You were talking about how sport is maybe the great.
No, I mean, well, not so much a great equalizer. It's just, it's one
makes
place,
people realize that.
It's one place where I've seen people. So like, I feel like if people look around, if you can identify, it's like, well, how did this happen? So you realize, oh, the boss is the boss because he's the son of the boss. It's like, well, didn't we get rid of, princes and stuff because we realized that's a really stupid way to pass down power? So why are we doing that in our corporations? That doesn't make much sense. And if you get people to identify that discordance and those contradictions, ones that they've already made that aren't necessarily associated with left or right politics, but just recognized with as things that we've realized as humans, is like, oh, well, that's a bad thing to do, and that is more ubiquitous and less political. I think that's generally where we could go. One of the other things that, looking over some of the podcasts, I'm reminded of, I believe it's episode 10. You spoke with Beatrice about student movements in the 60s in Ethiopia. And so I feel like students and the younger generation has a lot to do with how we can get out of this. Is perhaps we are too jaded. Perhaps we've experienced too much, and we've seen too many failures, and we've seen too many co-options and too many, corruptions, and we've seen too much, and we're jaded. And so, just as we can't imagine, the fanciful things that sometimes a child will tell you is right in front of them, perhaps that's what we need, is the imagination and the imagination, and I want to say the words that come to mind are disconnect from reality, but I don't mean it in a pejorative way, but just in that reality isn't made for them yet. Like, they're still.
But it is though. No, because if you think about it, like, okay, look at millennials right now. They're like suffering under massive debt. I mean, I'm technically I'm an old millennial, but and you are too. But I mean, I don't know, because I feel like they're very in touch with reality, like right now, and it's all economic reality, and that's why a lot of them went for Bernie Sanders, and also why so many of them are attracted to socialism, because it's like their material reality is fucked up, and I think that they're like looking for outs. The problem though is that there's also a number of people who are younger than us who are joining right-wing white supremacist groups and like listening to Dave Rubin and being influenced by that wing as well. So I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I don't want to fetishize youth, because I think that sometimes youth can also get shit wrong, and like,
oh no, absolutely.
You know what I mean? So like, we have to be careful too, not to like, yeah.
No, I can tell I'm not articulating myself properly. What I mean to say is that, like, they haven't accepted the world as it is yet. Like, they still think that it can change, and they think they can imagine a very different world than I think a lot of older those of us that are more older, or that are older or more jaded, can imagine. It's hard for us to imagine a world of equity and of true freedoms and liberty and stuff. It's hard to imagine like how the world could change in such a way that we could see that in our lifetime because of the experiences that we've had. But and perhaps even millennials are too old at this point in general, having the experiences that they have. But what I'm thinking of is like a 13-year-old right now, like what the world is to them. Like, they're still learning what it is, and like they're constantly confronting these things of, well, we're telling them this is the world, and they're like, but that doesn't make any sense. Why would we have a world like that? We should totally organize it like this. And it's like, so while that malleability can be fomented and moved towards the right, like as you mentioned, and that they can be emboldened by, and I think neoliberalism has done that. The way that race has been separated from the class argument and by neoliberals to focus on identity politics, and that type of identity does encourage the 13-year-old that just wants to make a 13-year-old joke and then gets this response from this neoliberal like part of society, and like they don't understand what's going on, and rather than really engage with that, they're 13-year-olds, so they just run to the right. That's what they do. And they find a group of friends where they can make those jokes and everybody laughs and they can be accepted, and they can find a pocket in society that embraces them rather than shuns them or whatever. And it's like, that's not to say that we need to coddle racist 13. That's not my point. My point is just that that we need to capture their attention and make our case in such a way that we need to capture their attention, and we need to make our case. That doesn't mean we need to coddle to them and make them feel good and like accept them and being accepting of their homophobia or their toxic masculinity, which I think when I'm starting to come to the realization is just any masculinity is toxic. And
we need to get them before they make the joke, though. You know what I'm saying? Like
exactly.
Like, we need to get to them at the point where they're like not even thinking about jokes like that, and they're thinking like we need to be able to say, you should see your fellow person as an equal to you, and this is why things like this might hurt them. And if you want to live in a society where you all are equal, then recognizing that pain and how you can also inflict pain upon people, but like pain that also later will functionally like limit their access to equality in multiple ways. That's where we need to get them, somewhere before they make the joke.
Yeah, and I mean, I agree. I guess part of it is holding out optimism for myself, because I mean, I was a terrible person when I was younger. I mean, I had a lot of. I think I was a good person, good natured in a lot of different ways. But capitalism, colonialism, being black in America, these things can make you a very angry person. And
I'm still figuring it out, obviously, because I'm the angry one of the two of us. So I'm somewhere on the.
Well, like, I mean, I was young and dumb, so I manifested my anger towards people that didn't deserve it, and like that came out in the ways that our society, emboldened and encouraged, and and was acceptable and would net me positive social attention, and it's like, and so like I don't want to give up or lose, or I know I believe I can be a revolutionary. I can be the type of person I want to be, and if I was that horrible person then I have to believe that these people aren't lost, that we're not lost, that they're salvageable, but then also everything else, my pessimism, my determinism, my all the other things about my cynicism, my jadedness of being where I am and life and experience leads me to the conclusion that at least if all those people are gone, if we are hopeless, the moldability of, like you said, the children before they make that joke, like when they're still correcting their parents, when they hear their parents say something that just sounds harmful to another human being, and they're like, don't we like other humans? Why are we being mean to other humans? I don't understand. Is like, instead of letting colonialism and capitalism reinforce the notions of, well, it's either you or them, so which one do you want it to be? Like, if we can get them before that and understand that it's all of us or none of us, and that that means that doesn't mean that we're all going to make it or that none of us are going to be harmed, but that if we take that approach, that we're all going to be better off than if we're all just in it for ourselves. And capitalism has for generations bred into people that this belief that we are like, that human beings innately and unavoidably will harm each other to help themselves. And perhaps maybe at some primal level that there's some truth to that, but we have frontal lobes and we're capable of quite a bit. And just like we don't accept the idea that, we're just going to club people over the head and bring them back to our caves and do whatever we want with them, we're going to set up a society that makes rules against those, even if they're not always effective. I don't even want to get into domestic abuse with police, but anyway, but like we can change how we view these things and how we treat them in society, and whether they're something that we accept and ignore, or whether it's something that we attempt to mitigate and reduce. And so that's capitalism, and the competitive, the zero-sum aspects of capitalism is one of those things, and I think socialism leads us there. And so when I see the movements, I'm happy when I see the younger people asking questions of authority figures that other people, that their peers may sometimes be too cautious to ask, because they're imagining a better world than even the liberators or the us revolutionaries can imagine. These kids, some of them,
the older generation of them, at least,
yeah. Some of them are imagining some great things, and there's potential there. And so, like, when we talk about, like, well, what is the hope? What can we do? So, like, I can understand resigning to a bit of hopelessness as an individual, but there is the world remakes itself with each generation, and over generations. It's we keep so much, and we hold on to so much, but the potential for remaking is there. We just have to embrace it and not let the next generation of kids think that this is the world that they have to live in, that there is no hope to stave off those problems, because there are, like the issue with the climate, or with the water, or with anything else, is that the people that are here just aren't willing to make the sacrifices or make the changes that they need to make in order to actually put us on a sustainable path. They're just not. They're like, it's not going to be my problem. I'll be dead before it hits the fan. So I'm just not going to do it. That's our actual problem. It's not that it's impossible for us to resolve these situations, or to at least mitigate them significantly. It's that the people here are making a conscious choice, and we're making a reality in which that's the future that we're leaving to those generations. And like, I have a personal guilt and all that stuff, but I don't think that should motivate other people to think. But the reality is that our future rests in whether people are willing to plant trees that they'll never see the shade of. And like, that is, if we can at least trick the people that are just being born and just growing, and the under 10-year-olds, if we can convince them that we actually believe that, like many of us were convinced when we were little that people actually believed the American dream and all that, if we can convince them that that's the world that they need to be in, and give them the tools to make that a reality, there's hope.
I think, okay, so yes, that's a generic yes, like, I agree with that, but I think that there's, again, I am influenced by my experiences too, and like, you talked a lot about guilt, but in my case, it's like seeing shit that young people do that scares the daylights out of me. So and even with sort of interventions by adults who are conscious, for example, and they're still looking the other way and saying no. I think that because, there's also a youthful sense of rebellion, right? Like, there's a sense that they know everything, and that, so I think there's that concern too. And like, I'm thinking about Brazil again, where the majority of people ages 16 to 24 voted for Bolsonaro, because you can vote at 16 here. And so, and their generation is often discussed much like how we discuss millennials in the US, in the sense that they're like having major issues with unemployment. They're not being, they're ending up in debt. Like, they're starting to have college debt here because a lot of students aren't able to get into public schools, which, like, public universities here are free, but much harder to get into. And then private universities are, there's some private universities that are very prestigious and, like, have great academic backgrounds and things like that, but they cost money, and so people have started to take out loans more frequently, and those prices are going up. And then there's also the issue of very rapacious sort of for-profit universities, just like we have in the US, who are expanding here and taking advantage of people, especially poor people. And also what there's a stat here that's shocking, but once you understand the political system and some Brazilian history, it makes sense. But the fact that people who were, the more educated people were, the more likely they were to vote for Bolsonaro. So it it basically like, I mean, and again, it goes back to like, what kind of education are you getting, right?
Mm-hmm.
Are you just learning for the test, which is super common here, or are you learning for learning's sake? Are you actually thinking? Are you being pushed to consider ideas that go beyond your understanding of the world? There's less of that, even in public universities and things. There's still very much a very conservative way of teaching and of learning. And the message that's being sent to young people is not necessarily one of like leftist revolutionaries. You know, I can say that with confidence. It's a very conservative message, and it's one about making money and surviving, which makes sense considering Brazil's levels of poverty and things like that. But still, the people who are filling universities and the people who are professors remain predominantly white, predominantly wealthy, and predominantly conservative. And so again, that set of ideas is replicated. And whenever people sort of protest and go against the system, like recently, you know, they had the implementation of affirmative action in Brazil, and you started to see more people of color, particularly of Afro descent or of African descent or of indigenous descent, going to college and being the first people in their families to attend college. At the same time, you have a president coming in now who plans to undo all of that. And so this sense of progress keeps going back and forth. It's not one that's like a continuous line. Again, as we see in any case of progress, right? And so that's why I think, from my perspective, I'm always really cautious when we start talking about even, you know, young people being able to reach them at a certain age or try to reach them at a certain stage in their education or whatever. And I don't want to be too negative, because again, I've been in a position where I've had to discuss things with Trump supporting students and ended up changing their minds just by their being in my class and the way I talked about, you know, issues of oppression and stuff, which I'm not one of those people who's just like throw away anyone who's young and supports Trump. Like, there are some people who are hardened Trump supporters and they can go F themselves. But other people who are like clearly under the influence of their parents or clearly under the influence of you know, like just bad messaging, like bad YouTube people and stuff, you know, I think this type of person can be reached. There are some people that I personally don't want to deal with reaching, but I don't want to like, that's just a matter of safety for me, right? Like, I'm not going to reach a Klan member, but maybe a white person can, you know?
Right, exactly.
But I think that there's, that we have to be careful about, again, I don't think that you are personally fetishizing the youth, but I'm saying in general, something that happens a lot is this idea, you hear this all the time, that like, oh, once the old Republicans die or the old white racists die, things will be better. And it's like, yeah, maybe, but those people have kids, and those kids listened to them and grew up under those racist old people and like whatever, you know what I'm saying? So it's not like there's a disconnect between the generation that's in power now and inflicting all sorts of violence and austerity and fill in the blank upon the population, and the youth that comes after them, the youth that they gave birth to, because ultimately they're in the same household. And like, I can't walk into someone's house and be like, hey, your dad's a racist son of a bitch. Like, let me help you. You know, it's not going to happen. And so I think that we have to be ready, I guess, at a moment's notice to kind of work with young people and help them really understand that people like Dave Rubin and whatnot are not the answer. People like, I don't know, like Milo and whomever else, like Angela Nagel at this point, are not the answer. I mean, I think that, and I hate to say that, but it's true. Like, we talked about her a little bit already, but the issue is like, I'm just going to name names. That is not the answer for the society that is going to make everyone equal. It's just not, it's not going to work, you know? And I think we have to be ready and find ways to communicate with people beyond this podcast, beyond the classroom, beyond Twitter. What does our engagement look like? Because I think your point about, what I do value very much about your point is that like, they can be reached at that age. They are still malleable. Their ideas are not so set in stone and form that there's no way to intervene and say, you know, offer an alternative. It just is a matter of like, what does that look like? And how do we expand? How do we take our message that we have in this small space among people who think like us to then go beyond that. And like, where do we go beyond that? And where do we have an impact? And I don't know where that is. I mean, I do and I don't. You know what I mean? Like, because not everyone's going to end up at college. So then they're not going to be in my classroom, right? And not everyone is going to go to a youth center and be, you know, like not everyone is going to have the opportunity to engage with people who maybe are left-leaning or who have philosophies and ideologies that are similar to ours, that are more liberatory. You know what I mean? Not everyone that they encounter is going to be like that. And I was thinking today too, just of like, I read all these articles that are so conservative. And who are they written by? They're written by people in academia. They're written by quote unquote historians. I joke because like their understanding of history is completely flawed, but they're written by poli-sci professors. They're written by philosophy professors. They're written by historians. They're written by these people who claim to have the answers, but who are, what scares me is that they're still teaching, right? They're still teaching. And so they're affecting how people think at this age when they are learning so many things for the first time. And they're going to be coming to that with and receiving a highly conservative message, and sometimes one that's completely historically inaccurate. So what do we do then? Like, I can't compete with like a load of professors in the economics department at the University of Chicago, right?
Meanwhile, they're being convinced that those professors that are telling them these conservative ideas are actually Marxists. So the real truth lies somewhere to the right of whatever they're teaching you.
Right. Yeah, because all colleges are like hotbeds of Marxism, right? Like,
right.
Let me tell you.
Went to one of the most liberal universities in the country, at least the one in my state, and it was like there was essentially, we had to have a special office dedicated for the people of color on the campus because we just couldn't put up with the rest of the campus. It was that bad. This is one of the most liberal places in the state, and so in Washington State. So I think what perhaps some of my framing and my intonation or my tone conveys the wrong impression, and even like my thinking at the moment.
And no, it's not you. Let me just clarify. I'm not just talking to you, right? Like,
I know what you mean about the fetishization
beyond what you were saying. Like, I think what you're saying is fair, and I think can be done, but it's a matter of like, how do we do that? But then also like, there is a side that going beyond what you're saying, because I think what you're saying is legitimate, but I'm talking about like the larger pop cultural framing of this idea of like the youth. Right?
Yeah, youth, I mean, the one comes to my mind is like the gun, the David Hogg and like that.
Yeah,
is like I have like you saw him. That's one. I think it was a very interesting reflection of this whole idea of you've seen him. I believe he's like his dad was part of the FBI or one of the alphabet agencies or something, and like you see him in real time digesting this stuff. Like he was just a kid at school living a rather privileged life, and then that privilege had a huge shock come to it in the event that he witnessed, and then he's like, oh well, I guess this is an opportunity for me to be politically active, and gets politically active. Is like, I'm gonna start thinking about some of these issues, and and you could tell it wasn't long before there was some mainstream Democratic people talking into his ear, giving him ideas about what positions were the right positions, and you see him then engage with people on Twitter and put the idea out there, and then see a big backlash on a particular issue and be like, oh, huh, and dealing with is like, and so it's like that's that energy in that youth is what has to be captured, and we have to make a case. We have to win. We have to win. like we have to win those arguments, and I believe, and from my experience and from my reading, that socialism will win. Like if like the colonization of people's minds and the competitive nature of capitalism, so all those types of things are going to be invasive the older somebody is, but if somebody's willing to engage with you and really willing to engage with the ideas and isn't completely just shutting out anything that disagrees with their established reality, then I think socialism wins on the merits of the argument. Like, And
It's better
so
freaking win, because good Lord, if it doesn't, we're already screwed. But like, I like what we have right now, and I know everyone always says this, but it's not sustainable. Like I can't imagine it getting more extreme than this. And the reality is, it very well could. And like, I can't wrap my head around it, because I mean, I've seen it in the worst state, right? Like, I've been to places where it's in what I would consider already an apocalyptic state, right?
right.
But I can't imagine it. I can't imagine that being my everyday, right? And I don't know.
Well, there's something about commercialism and capitalism that, like, we could just, like, the world could be burning around us, and as long as we have a show to binge watch, we'll be okay.
Yeah, or like, if I can buy like my face cream that I like or whatever, like if I have access to consumer goods, then I'm comfortable. But
Yeah.
it's when, but I mean, I don't know. We have enough going on in the U.S. that gives us a hint of what's to come, and there are enough things going on in other countries where that's the everyday reality. That's already, it's not a hint of what's to come, but it is what has come. So I don't know. I am very frightened of the prospect of things
What's weird for me
and locally getting worse.
What's weird for me is I don't have children personally, like, and so as of now, like, I haven't ruled out the idea of having children, but like, as of now, you know, it's my lifetime, and from a selfish, cynic perspective, is like, I can make it. You know, I can find some remote place where and fall off the grid and find and likely avoid nuclear fallout or whatever ends up transpiring when the resources start to fall or get short, like, and probably live most of a life that is relative in relative, you know, peace and you know, harmony or whatever, you know, if that's but like, I'm here fighting because I like, for something greater than myself or even my own personal progeny. But it's bewildering to me when people do have kids, like, you know, whether it's like the Koch brothers or like Donald Trump, and it's like, you have to understand what you're leaving for them. Like, you're just like, you know, the world's gonna basically collapse around you. Good luck with that.
Like, right.
Like, don't you feel an obligation? It's like, I feel an obligation just to my fellow humans. It's like, those are humans that are your progeny. Like, how do you not feel that obligation towards not just them, but the people around them, that generation? And it's just, they're like, oh, well, you know, we've got our nice family bunker set up, and we've got to deal with Amazon, that, you know, the first skyscraper that they built. Like, it was like, what? Like, it's bewildering to me. And so, like, it's for those of us that aren't going to be in that, which is most of us. Like, if you're not going to be in that club, like, gotta fight. We gotta fight, and we gotta win. Like, it just is. It's hard for me to imagine a more meaningful motivation than, you know, the perpetuation of anything good in humanity. Like,
we have to be able to break down the distractions. I think that's one of the biggest impediments, I think, for organizing in the United States. Because I think I remember back in the day, like when I was younger, I would say in elementary, high school, you know, one of the true, quote unquote, truisms I always heard was, you know, when people are truly oppressed, they can't fight, right? So it's when the people who are all the way on the bottom don't have the resources to really mount a fight. It's the people who are somewhere in the middle or whatever. But I was just like, that doesn't seem right, because like slaves rioted and like fought back and like killed their masters and stuff. And like, you know, people who are very much at the bottom throughout the world have always rebelled and like found a way to fight for their freedoms. I think, in fact, that what we see is the contrary, like the opposite of that. I think it's people at a stage where they are comfortable, where they have some sense of comfort left, where it's very hard for them to mount a fight. And I think what we see is in the United States, because we live in the metropole, basically. You know, if you're going to use colonial language, we live in the metropole. We live in the center of capitalism, you know? And we have, as I've always said to people, the best thing about the United States is you can get whatever you want whenever you want. If I want ice cream at 3 a.m., I can order it on Amazon, and some worker in a factory will package it and bring it to my house. You know what I'm saying? Like this is our, we have whatever we want whenever we want. If we have the money to pay for it, we can get it. And I think until we have a full breakdown of that comfort, we have a moment where, let's say, Amazon stops working. Like, can you imagine a day without Amazon? If people would like freak out. This is what needs to be disrupted to then, I think, make people get into the habit of fighting and really, really fighting, like mobilizing and doing something different than just. And I think, sadly, I would argue that while on the one hand, social media is in many ways empowering, and I think allows people to circulate ideas that they wouldn't otherwise have been exposed to. At the same time, I think it's part of that comfort model, because I think what it ends up doing is it makes our activism an act of consuming and like a sort of production in like as if it were a consumer good, right? So we think about something, we write about it, we tweet it, we put it on Facebook, whatever, and it's like this packaged, nice little thing that other people then consume, and then they feel good about having consumed that idea, right? But then there's no action after that. It's like a self-gratifying moment, and beyond that, there's very little action. And so what we have to be able to do, I think, is we have to be able to either create discomfort or have a moment where somehow we have discomfort, like real discomfort, for us to actually start as a country doing things to implement socialism. Because until then, we're too comfortable. It's not going to happen. It's not going to happen. And I think even the people, and when I'm talking about comfort, I don't just mean like literal material comfort, like I can order something on Amazon, but I think even the prospect of material comfort is hampering us. So people who are poor, who are told every day, you can be rich. One day you're going to be rich. One day you're going to be fine. This mentality that, this idea of we're all temporary millionaires, or we're not millionaires yet. We're just on our way, or millionaires on a bad day. I think that people say, this is also. Go ahead.
I had it in my head as something, but no.
It's something like that, right? Like everyone's a millionaire, but some of us are having a bad day.
Oh, temporarily embarrassed billionaires or millionaires.
Something like that, yeah, something like that. I can't remember the exact phrasing, but everyone listening to this will probably write in and be like, "How can you guys not know this? This is the phrase." Again,
like a pop
recent
quiz,
future. You got to be patient with me, okay? Recent future. I'm working with weird English right now. But yeah, I think that there is a real, it's like a lack of discomfort. And once we have real discomfort on a more universal level, and I think in a way that where we don't just feel like we're a millionaire down on his or her luck, but we really feel like, okay, no, this is poverty. This is suffering. This is loss. This is not having XYZ resources. Then it may be too late by then, but I think that's the point where you start to fight. And we have not, in most cases in the U.S., not all, because we've definitely seen responses, again, like Ferguson, like Baltimore, like Standing Rock. These are moments where people felt that and they reacted accordingly. People dismissed it, but that's what that was. These were glimmers. These were moments of what could be and should be the entire nation standing up. And we're not going to have that until we all we'd have to collectively hit rock bottom, I think, which is unfortunate, but maybe the case to really get people to get off their ass.
And I guess for the people that are still engaged in electoral politics at the national level, my perspective, and as pessimistic as it may be, is that the two sides are essentially arguing about the left is arguing that how to preserve or avoid that level of discomfort for U.S. citizens, period.
Right.
And that's where that ends. And the right is essentially saying, no, we can push them a little bit further. Yeah, we can push them a little bit further. And the left's like, no, this is far enough. And that's the argument. And you see it manifest in essentially every policy argument. Republicans want to make things worse, and Democrats are like, vote for us. We'll prevent it from getting that much worse. And that's the entirety of the argument. It's not, we're going to help bring you closer to liberation and freedom.
Right. It's almost like saying we've got this sponge to help stop the dam. Like, what? like, instead of building a dam, we're gonna just put some sponges in the water and hope for the best. Like, that's the Democrats right now. They're gonna put some sponges down in front of like a river that's about to overflow, and the Republicans are like on the backside of the water, just pushing it over the edge. Like, they're the ones who are really accelerating the violence and the austerity, but the Democrats are. Yeah, it's the stopgap measure that's not a stopgap measure.
Yeah, and we have a section of the population that's like that's arguing tooth and nail, like, well, you can't tell me that those sponges aren't preventing water from going downstream. Is that true or is that not true? It's like, well, yes, in the most technical sense, they are preventing some water from going past where we want it. But this is not a solution. This is not even a temporary stop. This is an aesthetic, something that gives people the feeling like they're doing something.
Right, it's the comfort.
Yeah.
It absolutely is that.
Oh, it's terrifying. It's like, I think if like some hackers got together and took Amazon offline for a week, would people be mad at a system that's allowed Amazon to be extend their tentacles into so far in their lives that they feel like they can't live without them? Or would they be mad at the hackers for upsetting their ability to get their, Amazon Prime thing delivered before, the next day? Like, which one are the, like, and that's why education, and when I say education, I don't mean, you need to tell the masses what they need to know. It's like, no, you need to engage with the masses and help them recognize, like, and recognize together as a discovering process together how their issues are caused by or related to the larger problems that we see in the systemic issues that we see with capitalism, imperialism, and so forth. Like, that is crucial. It's critical. It's the most important work for anybody that I think is bothering to even read or engage in this theory stuff. If you want to put any of it to practice, the most important thing is engaging with people. And I think you mentioned, is like, people aren't going to end up on the campuses, aren't going to necessarily go to the youth centers. So it becomes a responsibility of those of us that are listening and following or in line with these types of thoughts that we've been covering to interact wherever. It's like you'd be surprised, like, when somebody asks you a question, you're like, oh, how's your day going, or what have you been up to? Oftentimes we just give them a platitude. It's like, that's a great opportunity to actually just say something.
Like, we should just say full socialism now.
I mean,
and terrible.
It's like, I mean, and sometimes
the shit out of them.
It's like, sometimes it may be a bit blurty, or it may be but like, it can be like somebody asked me what I was doing, and instead of, just saying some mundane thing, I was like, you know what? I'm reading Pedagogy of the Oppressed. It wasn't, it was somebody that I would have assumed would have had absolutely no interest in that conversation, but I just said it anyway, because that's what I was doing. And I wanted to stand in my truth in that moment. And it's something I've been working on as a personal growth thing anyway. So like, don't tell people what they want to hear. Just tell them what it is. Like, and so, and they eventually, like, they seemed to take an interest, was able to discuss it a little bit. And I have no idea whether they're actually going to follow up and read it, or they were just being polite or what, but it felt like I had done something, and it was just one person in one instance. And I don't even know if they followed through, but it's engagements like that have the potential to unlock the energy and the ideas that we're going to need in order to stave off the worst possible outcomes. And so that I that's one thing I've learned, is that this podcast is a great tool as well, and Twitter can be a good tool in some cases, and other social media and other broadcast media types. These can be useful tools as well, and particularly in sharing these ideas with people, so that, like, sharing the idea to go out into your communities in the ways that you normally interact, and instead of just, saying whatever you think will make the conversation, and go ahead and be willing to engage with the conversation and give people some trust that they're capable of engaging in that conversation. Don't assume just because they don't look like somebody or seem to be acting like somebody that they can't possibly grasp it or engage with it in a positive or productive way. It's like, surely you're gonna come across people that are gonna be like, oh, one of those, or they're gonna have something negative to say, or what, like, that's good, but that's a risk, and that's a price you pay for wanting equity. Like, if you want it, people aren't gonna just give it to you. You're gonna have to take it from them. And I was like, and you're not going to be able to take it from them unless they're at least willing to give some of it up, and they're not going to give some of it up unless they understand why that helps them. And like, that's going to take engaging with them and understanding, like, oh, so like this issue that you're dealing with your landlord, who didn't pay, you were paying rent but they weren't paying their mortgage, and now they're trying to put you out. That's not just that guy being a jerk. There's a systemic issue at play there that if you get engaged in, we can attack the root issues and bring somebody like that into the fold. And it's hard. It's really hard, I think. And I've been trying to get so many things out. I've had so much bottled up over the last few months, so I apologize for so many things. I apologize.
I'm sorry too. Yeah, I've been so wait, really, really quickly, because I want to address something you just said about like working, like discussing things with people just in everyday interactions. This is something that actually, so I'm going to bring up Brazil again. Sorry, everyone. But in Brazil, they have runoff voting for like all elections. And so even for the presidential election, they have runoff voting. And the first round of voting, Bolsonaro, who's the fascist, beat the other guy who was running, whose last name is Haddad. And so when he beat him, of course, it was enough. It wasn't by enough for him to win the first round. And so there were 3 weeks, and then there was the second round and final round of voting in which Bolsonaro again won. But in those 3 weeks, one of the things that like a lot of Brazilians did, at least on the left, is they like went out and started talking to random ass people. Like they literally had this kind of conversation campaign where they would talk to family members and friends and really try to, and then again, people that they didn't know that well. Apparently there's some sort of conflict on the street right now. I'm sorry for the noise again. But anyway, people would go out in their communities and just like, at a coffee shop, whatever, and have conversations with people. And what we saw as a result of that, even though Bolsonaro still won, there was a decrease in his support in certain cities and things like that, and even among certain demographic groups. So in some ways, while it's not the most positive story because the fascists still won, it's positive in the sense that I think a lot of people, in reflecting upon doing this, really said, it's something that I've missed. I've been using social media. I've been using Tinder. I've been using this. I've been using that. I've been staying at home and watching Netflix. I have not been engaging in directly, speaking with people that I didn't know, or even people that I did know. Like everything that we do now for entertainment is personalized. And even everything that we do now for activism is personalized and consumer driven in a lot of ways, And so for them, they said that it was very, it was almost, liberating in and of itself to get out of the house, to talk to people, to really try to change and engage and think of different ideas and, perspectives of the world and everything. And to do that in person, in front of somebody live, like, touch and communicate with someone in front of you. And I think that's something that we're really lacking in a lot of ways. And I think is definitely a big part of the solution and a big part of reaching what we consider, socialist goals. The other thing that I wanted to comment on, and then we definitely need to wrap up because it's almost midnight here. It's getting so late and I have to go to a thing early in the morning tomorrow. But yeah, I think a lot of what you said here is really important, and I'm sorry that you've had to keep it bottled up for so long. It's because I've been, obviously for those of you who've been following the podcast for a while, you know that I have been the podcast was on hiatus because I've been out of the country for 6 months and haven't had the best internet everywhere I was, and also was on like a massively different time zone and things like that, so it was very difficult to even halfway think about booking guests and having podcast conversations. And in the cases of podcast interviews that I did do, a lot of them suffered from the technical difficulties that I was having with the internet. So like, I remember one podcast that I did, I basically would get cut off. Like my internet would stop working like every 7 minutes, almost on the dot. It was like, you can't talk more than 7 minutes, and it would just shut down after restart everything. So long story short here is that my sincerest apologies for having to put things on hold and for you to having to hold things in during that moment of hiatus. But hopefully now that things are starting back up with the Left Pocket Project and, of course, Reading Revolution, which is the series that you co-host with me, hopefully you can get out a little bit more of those ideas and not have to bottle them up so much. And while this was not fully a year in review, it was more like last couple of months in review, because there's so much that happened that it's almost impossible to review all of it. I mean, I don't even know how that would be. Like, we would leave stuff out for sure.
Yeah, it's more of a where do we find ourselves now?
Yeah.
Like after this year, you know, like we experienced this, and I mean, for me, this it's been a very educational time, and so like. I didn't mean to put any shade towards you or anything about the bottling it up. That's on me. It's like
no shade taken.
This space is I really enjoy this space, and I feel like the listeners that I've been looking around and like poking at and like looking into to some degree, or just paying more attention towards, and I realize that we have a very diverse audience, a wide ranging of age, lots of people that English isn't their first language, and people all over the world that listen, which is just amazing to me. And so I guess I apologize to some degree for my U.S.-centric perspective, but then I think part of the reason that people listen is because they know that that's going to be a part of what we do, but then also that we try to keep in mind that we live in a world, not just in a country or in a state or whatever, and in a city, and just our community, that we're part of a larger community, and that we all deserve respect and dignity. It doesn't matter what color you are, or how much money you have, or what country you were born in. And so I think getting more of us as a society to recognize that will help lift us all up. And this program, I think, has been crucial in the educating part of me, but I think I want to do more of the engagement with people. And so the hiatus gave me time to think about, you know, what does that look like, and how do I go about doing that. And so I have had the opportunity to like I mentioned, I gave the anecdote earlier, you know, of just taking some of these thoughts, and because I can't keep them bottled up for too long, just dumping them on random people into the streets. And so that's one way to get me, because I'm generally a very reserved and shy person and stuff. That's generally how I am. And so doing a podcast and talking about controversial things is very outside of my comfort zone. And talking to somebody in person, and about things that are uncomfortable, I don't know if that's closer or further from my comfort zone. But one thing I have noticed, and I think can give people some positive encouragement, is that I've been remarkably positively surprised when I've engaged people. This is my fault for underestimating and not putting my faith and trust in other people, but that even people that in a lot of ways I think we disagree, and that like I don't think that we can come to a similar points of view, or at least not in any time soon, that you can make progress, and that progress can actually be positive and have positive results in your immediate life, and then also for the people around you, so that, you know, that can manifest in ways of like sticking up for people when you see people getting bullied, or you hear people make comments that are disregarding or disrespectful of communities that you care about, that you have love for. And one thing we didn't really get to talk about, but that I look forward to also hearing your perspective of, and one of the critiques that I did think might have landed a bit on Frary, was regarding the masculinity and how that plays a role in all of these movements, and how they've manifested in history and currently. And and the detrimental and toxicity that masculinity brings along with it, and how that can also be a barrier in some basic communication, and like which is another reason, and the connection that I'll make with Tuesdays with Maury a little bit before we go, is just that masculinity prevents men from having many emotions outside of joy, and some joy, and then anger. Those are the emotional range for a lot of men within the masculine culture, and it's going to take a lot of love to be able to bring about any of the socialist changes that I think people that are listening want. And loving other men is definitely taboo in masculinity, and that's also that happens not just in the United States but in communities across the world. And so Tuesdays with Maury, and in living in one's truth, and just loving people, and letting that love guide you in your engagements will take you far. And I'll shut up.
I'm sorry. I thought that the key to socialism and the way that we would put it into practice is by screaming at women online. I guess I got it wrong. I'm sorry. I could have sworn that was the message. At least that's what I see a lot of. But I don't know. Maybe I got the wrong idea. No, but all joking aside, I think Richard is right. And it's interesting because, like, as much as we talk about the fight on the left, and a lot of the language that we use is like revolutionary and murder and violence and take what's yours, like there's very much an element that is seemingly like bellicose, like very war driven and like violence driven in some ways, which I think is absolutely necessary in most cases. But even in those moments of violence, like there's an element of love too. And I think that aspect is often overlooked. And one of the things actually that when I had on Sangeeta Sudarsan, I believe the third or fourth episode, one of the earliest episodes, she talked about this. And, we were talking about the place of violence on the left, but also the need for us to have love on the left, and for love to be sort of a guiding practice in our everyday understanding of leftism and its application in our societies. So I think in some ways, like, you're adding to that in large part, because it's something that I often forget, because I'm not loving. I'm totally into like fighting and stuff. No, I'm kidding. But I think it's just because the nature of what we see of leftism, at least in the U.S., like of leftism in its social media face, is very like it's not the real thing, obviously, in many ways, but it's also just so. It's not just justified anger, which is what I think I often exude. Like usually I'm like, I'm angry for a reason. This is why.
I know when I'm doing it, it's justified anger for sure.
No, but I think it is. Like, I think I have justified anger, but I also see sometimes, but usually like my anger is not meted out against other individuals. It's like this particular government official, or this particular systemic abuse, or this, you know what I'm saying? This particular institution violated people's rights, and I'm angry about that. It's not like me attacking, like going after somebody who has, like I'm usually not engaging in like one-to-one combat online. I'm usually like angry at a system. And so that's why I say I think I have justified anger. And usually if I'm reacting to someone who's an individual, it's because they did something to me first. Like I generally don't go after individual Twitter users. It's like, if you mess with me, then we're gonna have words. But if you don't, if you're just like commenting like a normal human being, you may disagree with me, and that's okay, and I have no problem with that. But some people are just like unnecessarily mean or like weird online, and they're gonna get a response from me, but that's because I'm a human being and I'm not like a blow up doll. But I do think that we do need more love, and that revolution in and of itself should be based in love. Like, it's a matter of love for your people. It's about love for equality. It's about love for your rights and the rights of others. And so I think that there is that element that we often forget to discuss, but it should be a big part of any change that we seek to enact in the world. On that note, because I'm an old lady and I have to wake up early in the morning, and because we've been talking for a long time, I feel like we've been talking for like 3 hours now or something.
Probably.
Yes, it actually is 3 hours because we started at like 9 my time and now it's almost midnight. So we have been talking for a very long time, as we tend to do. But I think it's worth it. And we haven't talked to each other in 6 months or more, right? So
yes,
it makes total sense that we would talk for this long. Because I think the last time I talked to you, I was also in Brazil. We had ironically, the discussion then was, "It feels like the world is on fire." I think that was the title of the episode.
Yes.
And this was like 6 months ago. So imagine where we are now. I think the world is beyond just being on fire. I think it's like some other state altogether at this point. Those were the innocent days. But I appreciate you being on again and joining me tonight to talk about a little, just a kind of recap of the year, but also getting back into the groove of podcasting and talking about these issues, because I've had a lot bottled up too, and I've seen a lot in my time abroad. I mean, I've been to Brazil a jillion times. Brazil feels like, when I came back to Brazil from Mozambique, I felt like I was going home already. Like, I'm not in the United States yet. I'm not a Brazilian citizen. I'm not from Brazil. Like, I have to clarify that, because some people online seem to think that I'm Brazilian, and I'm like, guys, I'm not Brazilian. I just study Brazil and I speak Portuguese, but I'm not actually Brazilian. Okay, like.
Wait, you're a U.S. citizen that like knows things about another country? Are you sure you're not? You're sure you're not a resident there?
And this is funny, because when I was in Mozambique, it was often a thing that was said to me, like as a joke. They were like, "Oh, you're an American who's like studying other countries," and I'm like, "Yes." They thought it was weird, like they, and they have a very negative view of Americans. Many people, which I understand. Like, I'm like, I get it. But yeah, it was. Even in Mozambique, everyone called me a brasileira, which is like the Brazilian. So even there, everyone assumed that I was Brazilian because of my accent. When I speak Portuguese, is completely Brazilian, because this is where I learned Portuguese and where I spent the most time. But also just because of the way I look. But even online, like even on Twitter, for some reason, I guess again because I talk about Brazil a lot, but like just to put it out there, I am not Brazilian. I'm from Tennessee, and I've said this multiple times, but I guess people don't hear me or something. I don't know. But I was born and raised in Memphis, Tennessee. My entire family is from Tennessee and Mississippi and like West Africa and England by way of slavery. That's it. Like, we don't have any Brazilian, no Portuguese, no nothing. It's like British and West African and Southern. That's it. Like, that's us. And so, I just have to clarify that, because like I feel like people are disappointed when they find out that I'm not Brazilian. And I'm like, it's not my fault. Like, it's where I grew up. I grew up in Tennessee. I'm from the United States. I have an American passport. Even here, like in Brazil, people are like, "What? And I'm like, "Yes, I'm American." Like at customs, people think that I'm like a Brazilian woman trying to be fancy, and like maybe who married an American who's using her American passport. Like, this is what I get at the airport all the time. And I'm like, no, I'm from the United States. So I'm from the United States. But anyway, when I came back from Mozambique, and I'm here in Brazil, and then I'm going to go back to the United States in a week. But when I was packing to come back to Brazil, I felt like I was going home. Like, I didn't feel like I feel like this US step is like superfluous, like it's not necessary. Like, oh well, I'll just stay here. Like, that's fine. Like, I know they're about to be under fascists, but whatever. This is my home. Like, it feels like home. And so I think sometimes, but beyond what I already knew about Brazil and like my experiences here, which again, we're sort of comfortable because I know people here, this feels like home to me. The reason I said all of this is because like Mozambique did not feel like home. And there are reasons that it didn't feel like home that I feel like one day we should probably discuss. And I think you and I have sort of discussed like off the record a bit about things that I saw and stuff that was just like really eye-opening. And I don't mean this in like I found myself when I went to Africa kind of thing. Like, I don't mean it like that. Because I know people have those experiences, and like that's not what I'm saying. What I mean is in the sense.
Yeah, we didn't see the Twitter feed with you like hugged up on.
No, I didn't have any pictures of African children, quote unquote, like TM, like trademark African children photo. None of that. But I did. I dealt with death. I dealt with I saw a lot of suffering. I saw a lot of poverty, and I saw things that. With regard to the state and foreign entities and whatnot, that made me incredibly uncomfortable. And I think that, perhaps it's worth having a short discussion about during one of our podcasts. Maybe the next ones that we do on Fidelity. I'm not sure if we'll have time, but definitely was an eye-opening experience in that way, and not in the sense that I'm blaming people from there for what's happening, but in the sense that like I'm reflecting on the history that I know and some of the things that the US and Europe did to basically constantly interrupt Mozambican development, and the ways that financial institutions from European countries and the United States continue to interrupt development in Mozambique, and to be able to see that on the ground in real time is really disturbing. And so I think that we should, maybe have a discussion about that. But my time away has also been a period of deep reflection and lots of bottling up that I need to let out at some point too, and that maybe we can do at some point when I'm back in the States or for the next few episodes. But thank you so much, Richard, as always, for extending some of your time to this podcast. Much appreciated. And as per usual, you're always the more eloquent one, and I'm always the one who's like, that's my setting. My setting as a podcaster when I'm not doing the interviewing and I'm just talking is like chaos. So thank you for being the calm amid the storm.
I'll take the compliment. I'll try that.
Yes, you should, because you're always like, you don't accept compliments well, but this time take the compliment, because it's true. And I'm sure people listening are like, they want to hear more of you. Usually, I'm sure when it comes to reading revolution sessions, and this is why, like, when I do the other interviews or when I do the other podcasts, I don't talk that much. Like, I want to hear more from my interviewee. But for me, when I'm the one doing the talking on this podcast, it's like, oh Lord. I don't know what to say.
I find your takes very insightful, and I appreciate your lived experiences, especially. Like, they're incredibly helpful for me, and I am so thankful for the space, and I'm thankful for all the listeners, all the patrons, and I'm trying this, living my truths or whatever, and I just want to say I love y'all. I do. I love y'all, and I care
Richard
about y'all.
Is not Southern. I don't know where he gets this y'all from.
I'm not Southern. My parents, my dad came from Oklahoma, and so
okay.
I every once when I get emotional or whatever, it comes out, and like I don't. There's no R's in wash for me, like, but they're still washing everything and like all sorts of good stuff like that. But I like
I'm just messing with you.
I got love for everybody out there, and I think we can do this. I think we can leave the world better than we found it. At least I don't know if we're gonna fix it, but we can leave it better than we found it. And that's what I'm working towards every day. And I'm glad that people are listening and enjoying us in the ways that they can.
Well, thank you, Richard, as always. And you're right. Hopefully, socialism will win. May not be within our lifetime, but it better be soon, because Jesus Christ. And on that note, thank you all for listening. Thanks, of course, as Richard said, again, thinking about others, but thanks for the patrons. Thanks for everyone who's been listening. And yeah, hopefully we'll be back soon. I think the next podcast will probably be out in January. We plan on releasing the first part of the Pedagogy of the Oppressed episode in the early January. And then hopefully the next episode by mid-January. Because I'm going to be out of town in early January. I'm going to Chicago for a conference. So for anyone who's in Chicago and who's not like scary and stalky, please feel free to get in touch with me, because I will be there for a couple of days to talk about Brazil, actually. Yeah, so thanks again. And that's it.
And thank you for listening to the Left Pocket Project podcast. By the way, we have in our next few episodes a discussion of Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed. You can find the entire text available on the Patreon page, which is patreon.com/LeftPOC. You can also donate to the podcast and the project itself by going to the same page and donating $1 or more. By the way, as I mentioned, nothing on the Patreon page for LeftPOC is behind a paywall. but our donations are used directly towards paying our assistants who take care of transcripts and other items for the podcast, as well as paying for web storage, data storage, and the like. I've given a breakdown of that on Twitter, which, by the way, you should follow the Left Pocket Project on Twitter by going to twitter.com/LeftPOC or just @LeftPOC. And you can also find the Left Pocket Project on Facebook, on Soundcloud, on Spreaker, and a variety of other places. So please feel free to drop us a line, a comment, a question even, and a donation if you have the money and the time. Thanks again, and have a good one.